Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the final day of our conversations, exploring today the social aspect of sustainability in animal agriculture. We have had fantastic conversations the past 2 days, and today is going to be another day of fantastic conversations. My name is Lucas Pantaleon. I'm a veterinarian, originally from Argentina, where I grew up in a very small town, agricultural town in the middle of the Pampas. And for about 20 years, I've been living in Kentucky, as you can tell by my Kentucky accent. So I work as a veterinarian and consulting for multiple organizations in the animal health space. And I also have the pleasure and honor to serve and at the board of directors for NIAA. So we know that numerous organizations conduct consumer research, and they have demonstrated that today consumers weigh several factors when making choices about food for themselves and their family. And traditionally, price, taste, and convenience have been the leading drivers of those decisions. But today, environmental stewardship and a host of additional factors affect our buying decisions as well. While each factor is unique, we can summarize them under the umbrella of social responsibility. Whether it's animal welfare, worker health and safety, as has been spotlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic this past year, the overall buying experience, the food's effect on diet and health, and more, we understand that consumers' buying decisions is complex. And it is increasingly important for us as leaders in animal agriculture to really understand the new environment that we are operating in. While we may understand that animal agriculture is economically viable and responsible in treating our environment, and we in animal agriculture are true stewards of our environment, we must continue to address the social aspect of responsibility. And we might take by, as a given that animal agriculture is good for society. But in today's world, we should always find ways to share these with a variety of audience and continue to communicate the good that we are doing in animal agriculture. So our first speaker today, Donald Moore, is very familiar and has traveled the world, and he understands really from a worldwide perspective the social aspects of responsibility. So I am really looking forward to Donald's talk and remarks, and then at the end of his talks, we'll hopefully have 5 to 10 minutes for an interesting Q&A. So Donald, I will turn the podium to you so we can begin with your presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lucas. And let me just share my screen. Make sure that I've got the right screen being shared. How's that? Can you see my presentation okay?
Perfect, Donna.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Lucas for a warm introduction and welcome, and to JJ and Morgan for the invitation to speak at today's conference. As Lucas said, I'm Donald Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform. I'm based out of Chicago, Illinois, but the organization that I lead has members in 37 countries, some 97 members, and they do business in about 150 countries around the world. And I spend a lot of my time, or I did pre-COVID, I spent a lot of my time traveling around the world, meeting with different livestock groups, particularly dairy farmers. But as was mentioned in my bio, I also used to chair the International Agri-Food Network, and I'm the past chair of the private sector mechanism, which engages with the UN Committee on World Food Security. So I spend a lot of my time in UN meetings, And to be fair, it's a little tricky at some of those meetings because there are some forces at play against modern agriculture that I'll touch on later today. But for a lot of the ambassadors that we meet with from countries around the world, we have to start by telling them what's agriculture all about. And then within agriculture, we can talk about livestock. And for me, obviously, within livestock, I can narrow that down again into discussions around the dairy sector. But let me start on today's presentation. And what I wanted to do as a sort of a framing to start off was to talk about what is a sustainable food system. And I know you've had several days in your meeting already where on the first couple of days you've spent time talking about the economic and the environmental impact. And today we're going to talk at the start of my presentation about the social impact that livestock has around the world. And then I want to get into discussing some of those forces that we see at play and that are somewhat challenging and also present opportunities for us in the livestock sector. But I wanted to throw this definition up at the start, and hopefully while I've been talking, you've all read it already. The bit I wanted to stress was I think this is a great definition coming from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, because at the end it really summarizes. It says that it must be economically sustainable, socially sustainable, and environmentally sustainable. And that has not necessarily always come through in some of the promotion around this concept of food systems and the role that they play in the world. But let me start off by talking a little bit about some of the social impacts. And I'm going to rattle through this pretty quickly, but I'm happy to take questions at the end. Animal sourced foods. They provide about 18% of the global calories in the world and 39% of the protein intake. And we need to point out that the protein that comes from animal sourced foods is very high quality protein. And I could spend 2 hours talking to you just about the concept of protein quality. But not only is it about calories and protein, but due to its nutritional density as a foodstuff, animal sourced agriculture is actually really important as a source of nutrition to the 2 billion people in the world today that suffer from hunger. And perhaps even more importantly, the 141 million children in the world who suffer from stunting and 47 million who suffer from wasting. And the way that livestock participates in the food system is really important. The FAO themselves came out recently and made this statement, which was that livestock contribute directly to global food security. And it's really important to have UN agencies like FAO really promoting the important role that livestock plays. And furthermore, and this is something that often gets overlooked, some 2/3 of the world's agricultural lands are permanent pastures or meadows. Livestock offers a way to produce food in areas of the world that would otherwise be unproductive. In terms of livelihoods, well, I guess probably everyone on this call knows some of these numbers, but there's 1.3 billion people, or 1 in 6 people in the world today, that depend on animal agriculture for their livelihoods. And we create a sector that contributes a staggering $1.27 trillion to global economies and generates some 40% of agricultural GDP. And the OECD is projecting that will rise by 14% over the next decade. And livestock offers a resilient financial security, and during drought, flood, or conflict, it's relocatable. Now, that's really important to think about in parts of the world that are not as stable as we are here in the United States. Being able to move your assets in times of conflict in the Sudan and parts of the world like that, it's really important. You cannot lift a crop and move it, but you can move your livestock. In Australia, with the forest fires that happened there recently, they were able to relocate livestock out of the path of the fires. Same in times of drought, you can bring feed stuff to your livestock, or you can move your livestock to adjustment. So it is a really interesting form of security. The other thing I wanted to mention was that 600 million of the world's poorest households keep livestock as an essential source of nutrition and income. And women represent 66% of the world's poor livestock keepers. And this directly supports the UN's goal of strengthening their resilience. And the other thing that may come as a surprise to some of you is that in certain parts of the world, women are not allowed to own land, but they can own the livestock. They can own the product that comes from the livestock, be it milk or meat, but they cannot own the land it's on. So livestock are a really important resource for women in many parts of the world in terms of strengthening their resilience. A few other elements I thought I'd just toss in here that maybe we don't think too much about from where we live in the world, but livestock also contributes to society and the food system in other ways through the provision of fiber or leather, provision of manure for fertilizer or energy. And in many parts of the developing world, livestock actually remains a vital source of power. For example, in India, 2/3 of the cultivated land is still plowed using draft power, and animal-drawn carts haul 15% of the country's freight. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure that if I was wandering down Fifth Avenue and I saw an oxen-drawn cart delivering to Saks Fifth Avenue, that I would know quite what I'd stumbled into. But this is very common in parts of the developing world. In countries like Sudan, South Sudan and Mongolia, wealth is measured in cattle more often than in cash. And again, in those areas of the world that are ravaged by issues of conflict, again, these become mobile assets. So cattle are king, not cash is king. Something that maybe is not such a happy thing to think about is that in some parts of the world, there is still this concept of a bride price. A bride price is what a groom must pay to a bride's parents for having brought her up in a good way, if I can put it that way. And this particular shot here is a bride price of 500 cattle that were being delivered to the parents by barge, and that was in the Sudan as well, that particular example. So livestock play a really important cultural and economic role in different parts of the world. But what's happening out there? I'm just conscious that this is the bit I really want to cover and talk to you about today. So what's happening in the world, and how is that impacting on those of us who work in the livestock sector? This will be of no surprise to you. We're currently sitting at 7.8 billion people in the world today, forecast to be up to 10 billion people by the time we get to 2050. At the same time, there are some forecasters suggesting that we will need up to 70% more food to be produced in order to feed that growing world population. And at the same time, we're struggling with this existential threat that comes from climate change. And those of you who follow the media on this topic will be very well aware of the amount of discourse, the amount of disagreement on what we need to do to address climate change in the world. And so lots of organizations have, in the last few years, have produced their analysis, their reports, their recommendations on what should be done to tackle the challenge of a sustainable food system that brings together nutrition, environment, social and economic outcomes. And I just threw a list up here of a few of the organizations, and not to forget that we ourselves also published on this concept of sustainable food systems as Global Dairy Platform. We did that with a panel of academics that we pulled together back in 2016. So we've been moving down this path of talking about food and agriculture as part of a system for some time now. But if you look down that list that I've thrown up there, you'll note there's a few interesting names, like I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Eat Lancet report that came out a couple of years ago, which recommended very drastic changes to the diets of people in the world, and particularly a large reduction in animal-sourced foods in our diets. And that's the point where the UN starts to get involved. And so this is His Excellency Secretary General Antonio Guterres, of the United Nations. And in late 2019, he announced the need for the United Nations to hold a food systems summit. Now, we were really pleased that it was framed as a food systems summit. This is the first time in 25 years that the UN General Assembly will actually talk about food. So think about that. Last time the General Assembly in New York had a discussion about food was back in 1996, 25 years ago. So this is a really interesting moment. And the other big summit that's happening this year is COP26, the Climate Change Summit. And I wanted to touch on both of those and give you some sense of what's going on within them. So talking firstly about the Food Systems Summit, this is, as I mentioned, the first ever Food Systems Summit in the world. And there are some lofty goals being touted for the summit, but there's something really interesting about it. This is what is known as a People's Summit, or it's being promoted as a People's Summit, not a member state summit. And that is really, really important to understand. No member state will be bound to implement or to follow any recommendations that come out of this summit. And that's made it challenging in other ways. There's quite an active program. It's been in place for some time now, and I'm not going to focus on the leadership end of the summit. It's led by Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who was Rwanda's Minister of Agriculture and is now the head of the African Green Revolution. But what I wanted to focus on were the detailed action tracks in the summit, and there's 5 of them. The first is led by Lawrence Haddad from Gain Foundation, and it's about ensuring safe and access to safe and nutritious food for all. And it's anchored by the FAO as the UN agency that anchors that. And by and large, I think livestock is, we're getting pushed pretty hard in Action Track 1, but they are taking a relatively balanced view about the role that livestock plays in the food system. And let's not forget, back to that comment I made at the start, 2/3 of the world's agricultural land is permanent pasture. You cannot plow it up. You cannot convert it into arable land. The way it contributes to the food system is through the grazing of livestock. Action Track 2, a little bit more challenging for us. In fact, a lot more challenging for us. This action track is about shifting to sustainable consumption patterns, and it's being led by Gunhild Stordalen, who is the founder of EAT. So it's been led by an activist group, and it's also anchored by the World Health Organization, which again has got some challenges for those of us in the livestock sector. So that's probably the most challenging part of the Food System Summit for us. Action Track 3 is about boosting nature positive production. It's led by João Campari. He's with WWF. He's the head of their food practice. He was previously a special environmental and sustainability advisor to Brazil's Minister of Agriculture. And Action Track 3 is being anchored by the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. This action track is the one where we're doing best as livestock. And that's largely, well, in part, I should say, is thanks to people like Ratan Lal from Ohio State. Ratan, as many of you will be aware, Professor Lal was the recipient of last year's World Food Prize. And he has gone on record during the summit as saying you cannot have a sustainable food system without livestock and the important role it plays in soil nutrients, etc. So Action Track 3, livestock's getting a better rap. Action Track 4 is about advancing equitable livelihoods. And you would think, based on everything I said earlier about the importance of livestock, that we would be doing pretty well in this action track. It's being led by Michelle Nunn, who some of you may know, and if you do, I would encourage you to have a conversation with her. She's the CEO of CARE USA, the American national member of CARE International, the Humanitarian Aid and International Development Agency. And it's being anchored by IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, another UN agency. And the reason I would encourage you to talk to Michelle is that within that action track, there is an incredible emphasis on the smallest of the small and the poorest of the poor, which is one of the challenges we often have within the UN apparatus, that they really focus on smallholders to the detriment of perhaps the sort of farming systems that we have here in the United States. And then the last action track, number 5, is led by Professor Salim Haq. He is the director of the International Center of Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, and it's been anchored by the World Food Programme. And here again, we've got some challenges as a livestock sector to make sure we're well positioned. But what I would say about the Food System Summit is it is intended to be held in September this year in New York around the opening of the General Assembly. They've yet to settle on a date for the actual meeting itself. And there's a pre-summit to be held in Rome with the agricultural ministers in advance, and then the summit itself in New York will be heads of state. The Food System Summit is a point in time. It will finish in September. It's really important because of the way it's stirring up discussion around our food system and what is sustainable and what's not. It has created an incredible platform for people to promote ideology. Although there is a science committee, a lot of the recommendations that are coming forward are based on ideology, not science. And the summit will end, as I said. But after the summit ends, what happens to the outcomes from it? And my belief is that they will end up becoming work inputs to the UN Committee on Food Security, CFS, the UN Committee on World Food Security. And that's when the member states then wrestle control back. And I think we'll start to see more sense coming out of this, and there'll be a lot more emphasis on what is practical, what is pragmatic, what is doable, and what does the science tell us to do. So that's the Food System Summit. And again, I could have spent days just talking about that, but I wanted to get onto this topic in maybe the last 5 minutes of my talk. And it's really the Climate Change Summit. So to me, this is perhaps a bigger issue for us than the Food Systems Summit. And the Climate Change Summit is the annual meeting of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. By the way, I think the UN does acronyms better than anybody else. I mean, this thing is laden with acronyms. And if you're wondering what COP stands for Conference of the Parties. So COP26 will happen in the UK, in Glasgow, in fact, later this year in November. It was supposed to happen last year, but due to COVID, it was deferred a year. COP21, a lot of you will have heard of. COP21 happened in Paris back in 2015, and it resulted in the Paris Climate Accord, the Paris Agreement, a new global accord on tackling climate change. And the most interesting thing from my perspective was the agreement itself was due to be enacted in 2020. So the measures in the Paris Climate Accord started last year, not back in 2015. And the Paris Agreement is different from previous climate change summits, be they Rio, etc., or Kyoto, in that all 195 signatory countries to the United Nations have signed on to it. And it's not just industrialized nations that are supposed to tackle issues of climate change. And they've really narrowed it down into three predominant areas: adaptation, mitigation, and minimizing of loss and damage. And all countries have been asked to make pledges to implement the Paris Agreement through what they call nationally determined contributions, which set national targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions either by 2025 or by 2030. Now, if you think about those NDCs, here is a little map that gives you a look at what they call the individually determined national determined commitments, individual nationally determined commitments, which end up being the NDCs. Countries were asked to state their targets for mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. 104 countries, those in red on this slide, included agriculture as one of the sectors in which they tend to make emission reductions towards their targets. 70 of these were in developing countries, and 15 countries, those in lighter red, made economy-wide mitigation targets, and that includes us here in the United States. But then just to bring this into a little more reflection for those of us in the livestock sector, the countries that mentioned livestock, which was 61 countries, and manure 46 countries, and grasslands 50 countries as priorities for mitigation, are shown in red on this. And the countries that mentioned livestock sector as an adaptation priority were 61 of those countries. They're shown in blue. Countries that mentioned both adaptation and mitigation are shown in purple. And I probably should have said a moment ago, the difference between climate mitigation strategies and climate adaptation is that mitigation is aimed at tackling the causes and minimizing the possible impacts of climate change, where adaptation looks at how to reduce the negative effects it has and how to take advantage of opportunities that may arise. Now, part of the reason I wanted to talk about the Climate Change Summit is 4 years ago, back in 2017, the UNFCCC embarked upon a work program they call Coronivia. Coronivia started at a climate change summit that was held in Fiji, and they've got the Coronivia Joint Work Program on Agriculture. It's been working for 4 years, and we've been actively involved throughout in the Coronivia Work Program. It is due to report this year at the Climate Change Summit. And I often say to people, You put agriculture on the agenda at a climate change summit, and you're putting livestock in the crosshairs. So we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that we as a sector do not come out of the climate change summit as victims, but as seen to be progressive and addressing the challenges that exist in agriculture. For the dairy sector, we have a very active work program leading up to COP26. We have a major program we call Net Zero Pathways to Low Carbon Dairy that we're working on with the FAO, with the International Livestock Research Institute, with the International Dairy Federation, there's a lot of groups involved in this particular initiative, but it's about raising the ambition in climate change right across the global dairy sector. So not just looking at the developed world, but looking at the 70% of greenhouse gases that come from the developing world in particular. And what can we do to raise the ambition to tackle climate change from the dairy sector globally? So my vision, if you like, is that we get to the climate change summit later this year and we can say, we know dairy is good for nutrition. We know that nutrition is good for health. We know that dairy is good for livelihoods. We know it's good for economic growth. We know it's good, it's good, it's good. We know all the good dairy can do in the world. And on the other side of the equation, we acknowledge that we, like all other agricultural commodity groups, and I stress all agricultural commodity groups, can do more and should do more to tackle our environmental impacts. And this is what we as dairy are doing to be a part of that. And I see that as an opportunity for us to position ourselves as a responsible sector. And the reason FAO is so excited about this program is they see it as potentially a guide for how other commodity groups, not just livestock, but how other commodity groups might also tackle their approach to raising the ambition on climate change. So in closing, what is the future of the global food system and what is the role that we in the livestock sector can play? Well, we believe that animal agriculture is at the heart of the UN's call to build back better, and it plays a vital role in sustainable food systems that deliver social, economic, and environmental benefits. We also feel strongly that to sustainably feed the world's growing population, we will need all types and all scales of farm, from big to small, from highly mechanized to highly traditional. And if we're to ensure the supply of vital nutrients and high quality proteins that are necessary, then animal sourced foods are a key part of that solution. We also believe that all forms of agriculture, whether they're plant or animal based, can and must do more to improve their environmental footprint. And we stand ready as a dairy sector, and indeed I think as a livestock sector, to play a pivotal and proactive role in that. And as a livestock sector, I think we need to recognize all the good we do in the world. We need to be proud of that. And we also need to recognize the challenges that we have as a sector and proactively address them, rather than have others set the agenda for us. And with that, I will conclude. I am happy to put my email address in the chat if anyone's interested in carrying on further, or if you've got any questions for me today, I would be delighted to answer them. I'll just have to work out how I stop sharing my screen, Lucas.
No, you can keep it like that, I think, for now, or JJ will work on that. There you go. Thank you, Donald. That was very, very interesting. And I have a question here from Ernie Shea. Solutions from the Land spoke yesterday. Is your group working with them on the reporting process at the UN? Thank you.
So Ernie, nice to hear from you, Ernie. Ernie and I talk regularly, and I have to say that Solutions for the Land are doing a fantastic job alongside a number of other ag groups. Ernie is very actively involved in the private sector mechanism to the UN Committee on World Food Security. And he and I are part of a group that is quite proactively engaging with the Food System Summit. So Solutions for the Land, hats off. They are doing a fantastic job. And I think it's great the way we can bring together different commodity groups. So Ernie representing farmer groups, representing a broader agricultural group, in conjunction with us and with a lot of other commodity groups, be it the Meat Secretariat, poultry, eggs, etc. We form quite an active little program working together to try and counter some of these messages that are coming through. I mean, the two biggest challenges I find in dealing with the UN, the first is that there is an automatic assumption in a lot of these UN meetings that plant-based foods are healthier and more sustainable than animal-sourced foods. And neither of those are true. They're not more sustainable and they're not healthier. There are some issues with both plant and with animal, and we need to make sure that we don't allow this assumption that plant is automatically more sustainable to continue. That's the first challenge we deal with. And the second is this one around size. Big is bad in the UN. Small is good. Low input is good. No input is even better. It's crazy, the thought process that goes on. And the UN FAO launched a report last year which talked about not smallholder farmers being the key to food security in the world, but family farmers. And that's really important for us to promote from the United States, because of course the majority of farms in the US are family owned as well. So emphasis on family farms. So yeah, good to hear from Ernie, and always enjoy working with him.
So I have another question here from Samantha Wilson. Do you think there is more we can do as an industry to collaborate with consumer influencers?
Yeah,
do you already have partners in this space? We see lots of influence in promoting vegan diets and alternative proteins, as you mentioned just now, but not many promoting livestock industry. So, that comes along with, we have a lot of very big influencers. I don't want to name names, but I think it was interesting that you mentioned, the very important role that animal agriculture plays, not only in the United States and developed countries, but also around the world, right? And we have people from different large organizations and even NGOs that, are fighting poverty, but also want to get rid of animal agriculture. So how do you balance those two things?
Yeah, Samantha's absolutely onto something here. We need to do a better job of engaging consumer voices in the campaign. What tends to happen in a lot of these meetings, like the Food System Summit, is you get those who have a real ideology to promote. It's not too many people whose ideology is status quo. It tends to be those with an ideology are fighting against something or for something new. And so they find it easier to mobilize voices in support of their position. As Global Dairy Platform, we've run a very active campaign to train 300 plus mobilizers, as we call them, social media mobilizers around the world in support of the role that livestock, the role that agriculture plays in the Food System Summit. But there's always more we can do. And I think we need to think about cultivating those voices and making them aware that the forces that are rallied against us are actually quite vocal. And although they're not necessarily supported by science, I got to tell you, I was talking at a conference the other day, and I made this comment that 2/3 of the world's agricultural land is permanent pasture or meadow. And this person, one of the other speakers, challenged me, and he said, well, who said 2/3 of the world's land? And I said, well, that came from an FAO report, a study they did. And he just turned around and said, well, I don't believe it, and carried on with his line. So we got to recognize that science is important, science matters, but there's a lot of people who don't pay attention to it, and that's kind of scary.
Yeah, it's interesting. So maybe I think we have time. I'll ask you one more question. So I think we've seen in this past 2020 and part of 2021 with the pandemic that it has exposed some of the fragilities of the food system value chain, right? And so what do you think we are going to learn from this pandemic, and what could we improve as animal agriculture for the future to better provide safe and nutritious food for everybody around the world?
Well, firstly, I would like to commend every farmer in the world for the job they've done throughout the pandemic. To not have had a humanitarian crisis at a greater scale than we did, to not have had the pandemic coupled with a crisis of food accessibility was phenomenal. And I think in the dairy industry, in the very early days of the crisis, we struggled, particularly in the developing world, because a lot of our value chains were aimed towards eating out of home. They were aimed towards hotels, restaurants, etc. And it took us a month or two to retool and to changed from that out of home to, offering in-home solutions. So there was a short spike in challenge there, but very quickly we were able to, to redress that. And I think the other thing that I would say that is vital, and I would encourage everyone on this call, if they're able to engage with the government in the US through, the government's going to hold food system dialogues, etc., to get engaged in them and to promote the vital role that a functioning trade ecosystem plays in the world for not just nutritional security, but environmental sustainability. And I'll come back and talk a little more about trade in a second, but it is absolutely vital, and it proved vital throughout the pandemic that we were able to move food around the world, so it got to people who needed it. And if you go back to, I think, the latest SOFI report, which is the state of food insecurity in the world, said that there were some 800 million people last year who went hungry in the world, never mind the 2 billion that were suffering from other forms of hidden hunger, but 800 million went hungry, yet we still threw away about a third of our food. If we could just balance, supply and demand better by a more open trade system, some of the civil society groups that we battle with, if I can put it that way, or we debate with, they regard trade as a bad thing. I actually think trade is one of the most important things that we can promote in the world. And I would just close by saying, here in the United States, our favorite fruit is the banana. Well, I don't know about Kentucky, where you're based, Lucas, but I know in Chicago, where I'm based, there's not too many banana groves growing, but we are really good at making meat, and we're really good at making dairy. Ecuador is fantastic at producing bananas. And so a fully functioning trade system that recognizes the unique environmental capabilities of different countries to produce certain types of food and then allow us to trade them is vital. And vital not just to nutritional security, but as I said before, it's also vital to environmental sustainability.
Thank you, Donald. That was a fantastic presentation, really interesting insights, and thank you for sharing your experiences with understanding a little bit what's happening with the food system around the world. And so, as we all know, we bring our own backgrounds, experiences, and rationality to any situation we are in. Our next conversation is with 4 individuals who all have diverse backgrounds. Leading the conversation, we have Danette Amstein, a marketing executive who works with a number of meat and poultry processors. And joining Danette is a registered dietitian and retail consultant, Kim Kirchherr, a dairyman, Ken McCarty, who leads McCarty Family Farms, which is the largest certified B Corporation dairy in the United States. And he leads the farm with his parents and 3 brothers. And we also have Mike Matson, a former journalist and press secretary for Kansas Governor Bill Graves, and current leader with the Kansas Farm Bureau. Danette, I will turn the conversation to you so you can kick it off. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. I'm excited to be here today to share with you in this really great group. We're going to have fun over the next 2 hours. Really, when they set up the title for this, I have to say, JJ, you gave us a little joke. So maybe by the end of this, we'll have the punchline for the joke of what happens when you take a dairyman, a dietitian, a marketing executive, and a press secretary into a barn, and one of us will probably be the brunt end of the punchline. But we'll see how this unfolds as we go along. Where our setup today is one where we're each going to share some opening comments and kind of lay some groundwork, and then start into just kind of a roundtable conversation. This is truly a conversation, so we welcome your questions, and we'll work those in throughout our time frame together in everything that we are doing here. I'm going to kick us off, and I'm so pleased to be following Mr. Moore in his presentation, because he gave us such a great outline of the social side of this. You guys have conquered the the economic and the environmental sides of sustainability. And so today in our conversation, we're going to try to stay in the space of the social sustainability area. And being in the marketing space for a while now, my desire has been to always connect the consumer with what's happening with the retailer. And then back to what's happening with the food service operator, back to the packer processor in the meat industry case, and back to the producer. So if we can connect everyone along the way and create conversations that are moving throughout the entire channel, we are far better off. And often the consumer takes us down paths that we don't necessarily want to go down. And so I'm going to share some data with you on that front. Now, JJ, I think you have control of my slides, which is fine with me. If you want to just kind of move us forward through those, we'll walk through those, and I'll take them here just very quickly, because I thought I'd use this as a chance to kind of set the stage from what the consumer is saying based on what we hear. We monitor a tremendous amount of social channels on a regular basis, and we use that for our own purposes in research to help our clients understand what's being said, both in real time, and then we have access to historical posts to see kind of how the trends are flowing, if you will, and what's emerging and what is declining. Not included in this data is yesterday, and Earth Day, and kind of where the conversation was going. And we saw some peaks and valleys where it was very much moving in a plant-focused direction versus animal production. And that was, of course, a concern to us. But we use this data for this. So this is just a quick slide. So if you want to go ahead and forward it there, JJ, we broke it down into 3 different groups for you very quickly today to show what it looks like if we break it down into the different conversations. Now, keep in mind, this listening data doesn't allow us to dig into the source, whether it's a media source, a corporate source, or an individual source, but it just gives you overall context here. So I'm going to share beef, pork, and plant alternatives with you. So just the pie chart on your left is just total mentions, and we broke it, kind of into where we were in that March to June timeframe as COVID really ramped up and production issues were in place, to then comparing it to the December to March of this year. So just kind of giving a sense of where our volume was, more volume as we come into last month than what we had in the previous volume. But then if you look to the right there, our positive intent in this positive sentiment of the conversations in the time frames versus our negative. So we were about, let's see, the beef industry dropped about 14 percentage points as far as negative sentiment between last March through June compared to December through this previous March. So negative sentiment went down. Positive sentiment also dropped, but just a smidge, about 4%. That means we've got a lot more people in the neutral space than we had prior. Now, neutral is better than negative, but neutral is not positive. So we have to continue to work to move them into that space. An example of the kind of things we saw, we just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of that, JJ, if you'll move us on to the next screen, is just some examples here. And I know you can't read them, not going to ask you to read them, but conversations that happen in Twitter, particularly around when we were seeing meat plants, packing plants being closed down and early in COVID, and the concerns there about food and where it was coming from, or how COVID was going to impact production, or how meat packing was going to impact COVID. Those types of conversations that were taking place. And then on the positive side is how it involves in a diet, how beef should be part of a diet, or how it is part of a diet, or typically we see a lot of positive comments around specific claims, whether that be a never ever claim on antibiotics, or it be a grass-fed claim, whatever the claim might be, that consumers like to talk about trying a new product that falls into that space, and that's usually a pretty positive space for the industry and for consumers in particular. If we move on to the pork slides, we can see that it looks a little bit different here, as our volume of mentions last March through June was higher than it is right now. And there's some interesting things going on here that we can talk about as well. But we do have some good things happening in the overall space for sure. So we look at this, both timeframes, pork was definitely dealing with more negativity than positive, and that really is interesting with pork, because sometimes it can be a very polarizing protein. And there's certain events that cause that to happen. Sometimes they're consumer events, sometimes there are industry events that can cause that to try to get out of kilter, if you will, and want us to move more into the neutral and then into the positive space. So JJ, on the next slide, just some examples of things that we saw in the negative area happen, a variety of things. One of the things, you see the picture there from CNN when we had a fake CEO for Smithfield on a talk show and on a news show. And so that did not turn into be a very positive thing for the industry by any means. Wasn't something that we would want an activist ever doing, and hopefully the things are put in place for that to not be the case. In the positive space, we had a tremendous amount of very positive mentions and information put out by the National Pork Board last year. That does seem to have changed in this year, and I'm guessing it's either a strategic change or it's a keyword change or something that's causing them to put their focus somewhere else. But the positive mentions that we saw during the March to June timeframe, which was certainly very important in the industry as people were having a variety of conversations, came from this area where the National Pork Board was able to move those things forward. Sustainability for the pork industry really isn't talked about as much as it is for beef. And it's really interesting because when folks do talk about pork, they're talking more about nutrition right now. They're talking more recipe-based conversations than they are in the beef industry, where sustainability is getting a lot of conversations. And then finally, just a quick look at what's happening in the plant-based space, a little bit more evenly split between the March to June timeframe as far as volume of mentions and the December to March of this year timeframe. Certainly, we see a lot of negative in that earlier timeframe for the plant-based alternatives, and that has really kind of shifted as we look at the later timeframe. So while consumers' thoughts around plant-based alternatives are still mixed, the positive side of things certainly seems to come from the media. Just from our own glancing through, when we look at all the tags, the media has really been pushing the positive. We saw that yesterday too, with Earth Day in their reviews. But there is still some negative sentiment out there. It has dropped more. It has dropped more. It's gone more positive, I should say, if you compare it directly to the beef and the pork over the last year. If we look just at the last slide that I've got for you here on the negative conversation, or on the conversations, they're really about, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was really more centered around processing. People didn't want to eat some of these products because of the processing, because of their claims, because of their ingredient labels. They would be like, oh, I'm going to stay away from that. And then when it's gone more positive, it's more in their discovery of this and putting it in their diets. The fact that they've recently tried it, that they've become more of a staple of their diet. So there's a lot here that just kind of helps us in our efforts understand the flow of conversation that's taking place between each of, or in the social media space, and how it comes into the sustainability conversation and how consumers think about our products. So just wanted to share that example as we get started. And JJ, we can get rid of those and see the panel. In fact, I want to turn it over to Ken, because if we're going to walk into a barn, we should probably start with the one that spends the most time in the barn and let Ken give his opening comments, and we'll go from Ken to Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Danette, and thanks everyone for allowing me to be a part of this today. So, as I reflect on yesterday being Earth Day, and I reflect on the efforts that the McCarty family farms and our partners in Ohio, the Van Tilburg family at MVP Dairy, have tried to make in the realm of sustainability. Years ago, when we began to have conversations around sustainability, it was very much based in being green, being environmentally friendly. And I think that that's all fine and well, and it's an obvious connection, and it's a very important piece of the sustainability conversation. But as our business has matured and our opinions and philosophies towards sustainability have matured, that we've moved into a more holistic view of sustainability, and the social aspect of that, I think, is one that for those of us that are based in rural America has to be a key pillar of that sustainability movement. You know, as we think about the future of our business is based and is heavily dependent upon the communities in which we live. You know, the school systems that support the families that support our farms, the local businesses that support the families that support our farms. You know, without that social aspect being incorporated into the sustainability conversation, the future of rural America, the future of agriculture is much bleaker than what it should be. So, you know, as we've tried to incorporate that social sustainability aspect into our everyday mantra, you know, we've made the commitment to become a certified B Corp. Our customer, Danette North America, led the way and was a great support for us in making that movement. You know, and it's become more of a personal mission for my brothers and I, our partners, and the team of employees that we get to go to work with every day. We're committed to trying to hire families, put kids in schools, invest in our communities, not only from a financial point of view, but from just a social commitment. And I think when we think about sustainability, that social aspect, the environmental aspect, the responsibility to being good brand stewards, they're all intertwined, and we can't advance one without advancing the other. So again, thanks for having me here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, Ken, I think you hit on some very important things. They are all intertwined, and it's often that folks that don't care for our message want to just eliminate animal agriculture. They want to eliminate something, and yet they don't think about the impact it has on the other aspects of their lives as well. So that would be a good thing for us to dive into when we get to the panel conversation. Kim, how about you share your thoughts with us?
Thanks, Danette, and thanks to JJ and the team to be here. And it's a pleasure to follow Ken, because I often say that farmers and dietitians have a lot in common. We're science-based. Nobody really gets what we do. We think our work speaks for itself, and we're realizing that we need to tell our story a little bit differently and a little bit more often. And so that's kind of the perch that I'm sitting from. And as a dietitian, my job has always been to increase understanding and inform my audiences, whether it's an individual patient, a group of people, peers, the lay public, you name it. It's how do I help inform and inspire change that they need to make to do a better job managing their health. And that does not mean prescriptive. And I want to emphasize that, because I feel like right now, especially in social media, we're hearing these conversations that everyone needs to eat the same way. It's certain foods that do certain things. And I loved what we heard the last couple of days about how important framing is, and the notion that the second part of agriculture is culture. Because when we actually look at food and how a dietitian like me actually performs our job, is we know it's culture, it's social, it's emotional, it's religious in some cases, it's very personal, it's tied to your budget, it's tied to your skill set. I could go on and on about all of the different reasons why people choose what they do to eat. So again, it's not about being prescriptive, it's about listening to what they want to know and what they need, and helping them find their way to a better path forward for their own health. And to do that, we kind of need to look at both the value and the values. And we've heard a lot about that the last couple of days. And what I mean by that is, what are you getting for the dollars and calories that you choose to spend on your food? Nutrient rich, nutrient density, however you want to define those. I will tell you, there's a lot of people who don't know that meat is a source of protein. That is like for everyone on the call today, or the webinar, but I feel like we need to start at the beginning of the story. The other piece of that is, if you look at Nutrition Facts Panel, and Donald had a picture of that in his talk this morning, potassium is now a nutrient because of current science that is on that panel. A good portion of people do not know that dairy and meat are a source of potassium. So if we can start to bring those value conversations aligned with values, and so often we hear only 2% of the population is tied to agriculture, let's flip that. That means 98% are not tied to agriculture. So we've got to pull way back and help them have the context and understanding that they need. And then we have to decide what our goal is. Are we trying to take action with this positive, proactive storytelling to change the conversation or to change consumption? Ideally, it's both, but I will tell you, if I asked any one of you individually to tell me what you ate in the last 24 hours, which everybody thinks we run around as dietitians asking that, would you tell me the truth? Now, it might be because you forgot something. It might not be intentionally misleading, but what people talk about in social media and what they actually do are not always aligned. So yeah, we want to change the positive conversation and we want to make it more positive and more informative, but we also need to think about the fact that what they're saying and doing might not match, and we need to bring those two things together. So how we talk about people, we say the word consumer all the time. Consumers are consumers once they're consuming something. How about we start framing the conversation to the shopper and the decision maker to invite them to become a consumer of whatever they want to buy? And it's wordsmithing, and it might sound like minutia, but would you rather be called a shopper, an individual, a patient, a consumer? How does that feel? And it's kind of that squishier part. And then the last thing I'll talk about is the word sustainability, because I'm really anxious to get to the rest of the panel and hear what everybody has to say and ask us. But when I think of that word sustainable, you have to remember my perch. I worked in healthcare. I was an outpatient dietitian, one-on-one conversations with people who just got a chronic disease condition and a diagnosis from their doctor that they now had to manage. So there's that perch. I worked for the #1 retailer here in Chicago and with the biggest group of independent retailers around the world with 6,000 stores globally. And I've also worked for America's dairy farmers, and now I work in agriculture, healthcare, retail, kind of all mushed together. So that's the perch when I answer this. But just as Ken said, all of this is tied together. We need sustainable businesses. That means farmers, it means retailers, it means restaurants, it means hospitals, and everyone involved in all of that. And I could go on, but I won't for sake of time. But everyone in that equation needs to be successful, because otherwise, where are we going to get our food? Where are we going to get the healthcare that we need when we need it the most? So sustainable business is one way that we use that word. What about sustainable health or sustainable behavior? If I see a patient or I'm talking to an audience newly diagnosed with heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, or anything else where nutrition plays a role, how are we talking to them? It's not a 5-minute change. It's not a 5-week or a 5-month. It's a lifestyle change. Are we making it easy to make those behaviors sustainable and helping them see how they can eat their favorite foods? And then lastly, sustainable food. It's nutrient rich. Is it balancing natural resources? Is it accessible? Is it affordable? Is it culturally relevant? Are we talking about heritage and legacy and what those foods meant? And if we get a chance, I'll tell you my favorite sausage story. I was approached at a train station from a guy on a crew from a TV station, and he said, "What do you think about sausage?" Dietitian, right? And I'm like, "What do you think I'm going to say?" And it shifted the conversation, because he's like, "Well, you're going to tell me it's high in sodium and you're going to tell me this and that." And I said, well, let's actually pull back to why sausage was invented and what the role of salt is from a food preservation standpoint. And we were waiting for the train. We had time to dig in. But when we start to talk about that, people don't remember or don't know the role of ingredients or components, what we're doing from farm to table. So I'll pause there and stop, because like I said, I'm really excited to get to the rest of the panel. But thank you again for the chance to be part of the conversation today.
Going to be a fun conversation when we get into the roundtable part. Kim, I'm just going to go ahead and confess right now that I would underreport my chocolate consumption and probably overreport my vegetables.
You are not alone in that.
Yeah. So we can come back to that as we talk about this in a little bit. Mike, press secretary enters the barn. What happens?
Yeah, thank you all for the invitation to participate. This is a fascinating conversation, and so I want to lend some thoughts related to the perspective of the family farmer. Right, I'm sitting here in my office at Kansas Farm Bureau in Manhattan, Kansas. We are, as you all know, a tradition-driven, hidebound, conservative family farmer rancher organization, and we are slow to change. So first thing I want to say is dinner last night, cheeseburger, French fries, and Ken, ice cream. Okay, so that, and I'm happy to have that every night, right? It's like old habits die hard. So I want to talk about 3 things to set up. I want to share with you a conversation that was started a generation ago in this organization. I want to talk to you a little bit here in this opening sector about the perception of the folks whom I am privileged to work with, family farmers and ranchers, and how they approach the notion of food. And then I want to get into, I want to touch briefly on the practical reality of how this mashes up against policy and politics, which is what we do in Farm Bureau. So first, this is my second time around with Farm Bureau. I came directly out of politics. I was, as was mentioned, I was press secretary for the governor of Kansas, and in Kansas, governors can serve 2 terms. And so when he was reelected, those of us on the senior staff started looking for work, right? And you know how that works. It's who you know and right timing, and that led me here to manage the policy communications of this organization. That was the year 2000. That was 21 years ago. My first job was to get a sense of what do we need to say, who do we need to say it to. The 2000 census in Kansas was the first time that urban and suburban Kansans outnumbered rural Kansans. And that's not unique to Kansas. That's a middle of the country demographic. And so for the first time ever, this tradition-driven, hidebound conservative organization had to have a conversation about who are we talking to? Because for 80 years, we had been preaching to the choir. And then all of a sudden, we need to start talking to other people. And that was hard to do, right? You just don't pivot on a dime and change the way you communicate out loud. And so that took a while. And there is an argument to be made based on the data that Danette shared, based on the comments that Ken and Kim have mentioned, and the one that Donald wrapped up at the end of the last segment. There's an argument to be made that everything we've done in the last 21 years ain't working. It's not working. That's a hard conversation to have in Farm Bureau world. All right, so how's that impact family farmers and ranchers? We represent the salt of the earth. We represent the people that would give you their left kidney if you ask them, and they don't even have to know you very well, right? And they have a frame of reference and a culture in which they have been raised that they don't have to think very hard about, right? This is my way of being. This is the way I present myself to the community. I grow raw commodities. I grow wheat, corn, soybeans, milo. I have a cow-calf. I might have a hog operation. I grow raw commodities and I market them, and then I think about the next crop. I don't think about what happens to my commodity when I sell it. And so what we have to do in this system is to take those family farmers and ranchers that next step, and that's some of the work that's been done the last generation, right? Helping to connect the producer with how their commodity actually becomes dinner, right? And so that is a time and labor intensive process. So, and that still exists today, 21 years after it was started, that concept still exists. And the last thing I'll say, and we are struggling with this now, and this is where the notion of the word sustainability bumps up against the work that is done in an advocacy organization like ours, right? The word itself is oftentimes difficult for our folks to kind of get their head and their heart around. They think green, they think environmental, they think EPA knocking on their door, telling them not to do what they're already doing. And so that is a difficult conversation to begin with. Add in the politics and the events of 2020, and it becomes a really difficult mountain to climb. There are the last 4 months in this organization, we are dealing with issues that were always there below the surface, but 2020 bubbled them to the top in terms of the way people on the ground in rural America think about politics and policy. And so we're fighting that battle in addition to all the lobby battles we fight. And I will give credit to our national organization, the American Farm Bureau Federation. They saw shortly after the election in the fall, they recognized that this conversation was coming at the federal policy level and said, we need to be at that table. And so they have been working since that time to make sure that those of us at the state level, all the way down to the county level and the farm level know that they're doing what they need to do, because that's what we do. That's what we do best. We lobby, we advocate for family farmers and ranchers in government, And we have traditionally succeeded, and we have succeeded. Last thing I'll say, we have succeeded because we haven't had to work very hard. We've always had the political will to get what we want in a commodity title, in a farm bill, but those politics are changing. They started changing a generation ago. We're seeing it through the data that Danette showed. And so that's what we're dealing with. I started to sound like a preacher. I apologize. I'll wrap it up. Again, I want to thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and eager for the conversation. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I think you hit on something that I think would be a perfect place for us to start for our audience this morning. And let's just go around the horn and define sustainability, maybe not based on how you personally feel about it, but how your work, the area you work in, how it defines it. Can you touch a bit on that in your opening comments? But if you'll take us back there again, and we'll just go back and do that now.
Yeah, sure. For us, sustainability begins first and foremost with financial sustainability. I can be the greenest business in the world, and if I go broke doing it, it's all for nothing. So, I have to be financially sustainable first and foremost. Beyond that, I need to have a sustainable ecosystem around me. And that ecosystem has to include the local communities and the local stakeholders that are involved in my business. They may be key suppliers, they may be school systems, that might be other local businesses that are fabrics of my communities that support me, like hospitals and so on and so forth, grocery stores. But beyond that, I also have to have a sustainable approach to the environment around me. I'm based in Northwest Kansas. Water is drying up and going away. Without water in Northwest Kansas, the future is essentially nil. So we have to, in our business, has taken the approach to being extremely conservative in our approach towards water use. There has to be an environmental approach to that. And then beyond that, I think sustainability at this point has to incorporate the sustainability of the industry itself. So without a bright future for the dairy industry and the dairy industry as a whole, I'm out of work. So if the consuming public, or in Kim's words, the decision-making public or the shopping public decides that the dairy is not good, then I need to start applying for jobs. And I don't really have a deep resume. I've just worked on the farm forever. So anyway, at the end of the day, sustainability has to be full circle for those of us that are involved in agriculture. And it can become a really overwhelming concept. At least at times it can become overwhelming to me. And not everyone can be impactful on every facet of that full circle sustainability view all the time. But we can be impactful on that, on portions of that all the time. You don't have to, how do we eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time, right? So, I think what happens too often is the concept becomes so obtuse and so big that we just decide, well, I'm going to back away from it entirely. Wrong viewpoint in my mind. We need to be impactful where and when and how, and to whatever extent we can be impactful all along that value chain, because otherwise the future of our business is pretty bleak. And the future of the ecosystem that sustains our business is bleak. So my view of sustainability is pretty broad, and my approach to improving it is do what you can when you can, ultimately.
Well said. I think we can all learn a lot from that. And you think about Ken, if I remember right, you're fourth generation, so you also have the desire to be able to pass this down to the next generation and the generation after that. So all of these have to be working well now for there to be the opportunity for that in the future.
Bingo. Exactly right.
Kim, from your perspective, what's sustainability?
So Donald showed the sustainable food systems definition this morning, and actually FAO and World Health has a wonderful other document from, I believe it's 2019, talking about sustainable healthy food. And it kind of goes through all the different things from a people, animal, and planet perspective, and kind of ties it all together. And I'll just jump off of and build on what Ken said. It's all of it together. And if we over-index on one thing, the others can suffer. So we need to look at sustainability from that broad lens and know that everybody that's involved all along the food supply chain, including our end audiences who are actually consuming those foods, everyone needs to be successful. And that is a tricky conversation because sustainability is defined, I would say, almost independently to each individual that you talk about. So I feel like when we delve into this subject, we need to first ask someone what sustainability means. And one of the things that I think we can do is actually, if we're surveying people to try to get some data about this, can we define what we mean by sustainability before we ask that question? Because my concern is every single person's answer to that question is different. And some people are going to be about the planet, and some people are going to be about food waste, and some people are going to be about energy. And like, you could go on with all of the minutia that all ladders up to being so important, and it all is important. And because people don't know inherently what's going on the farm anymore, that conversation starts at the farm, goes all the way through to the landfill and beyond, if you will. So what's your definition of sustainability? It depends on who you're talking to. It depends on what the end goal is. And it depends on what we're trying to accomplish in that conversation. So I'm not being evasive. It's just, that's kind of my technique with all of this in the farm to table space in the best way possible. Is I think we need to start answering questions with probing questions to say, well, tell me a little bit more about why you're asking me that or what you mean by that, because I think we'll get a better answer if we understand the other person's definition instead of going from our definition, if that makes sense.
It does, Kim. And Mike, before I go to you, I'm just going to interject here. Part of the research we've been doing on this topic is to first ask them what they think sustainability means, and then provide a definition and ask some more questions. The interesting thing across the last few years is really, if we go back even 3, maybe 4 years, sustainability was more about animal welfare. It was more about a little bit of health. It was really more there. Now, fast forward to March of this, just last month, sustainability is about climate. It's about the planet. Mm-hmm. And so we really see that sustainability becomes what is important to me at this moment in time. And that changes for everyone based on whether they've gotten a diagnosis and are sitting in front of you, Kim, or they're learning of a friend or family member that's in a different situation, or they're hearing about a climate accord. It all changes where they're at and how we best can talk to them.
That's perfectly said. And just real quick, actually, if you look across all of the voluntary animal welfare programs that are out there, I actually built a slide to show them all. So beef, pork, turkey, chicken, like everybody, veal, all of the quality assurance type programs, if you will. If you dig into each one of those websites, you will see those moments, employee health, animal welfare, like everything's in there. So we've got the tools. Mm-hmm. I just don't think we've realized how important telling those parts of the story is. So I love what Mike said when he was talking, because it's like, we've got the content and we've got these resources. Now, how do we package it and start telling the details that we didn't think anybody cared about?
Good point. Mike?
Yeah, take Kim and Ken's comments and times two. I think they're both exactly right. And I love Ken's comment about the word obtuse, right? It doesn't take long for these things to get really high level and really convoluted. And it makes me think of a couple of things. Gosh, it would have been 2008, 2009. We did a television documentary when the conversation on animal welfare first started to get real. We did a television documentary called The Care and Feeding of Farm Animals. And the notion was to get in front of consumers, right? Here's what we do. And we many of you know Lee Bork, right? A leading feedlot operator here in Kansas. And we put Lee on camera and he said all the right things, and he said the consumer's always right. That's what's led us to this. And then now I think, 12 years later, how outdated that message is related to this notion of sustainability. A couple of things related to the way the people I work with think about sustainability. It won't take long when you're having a conversation within the Farm Bureau world for them to get really defensive. We do terracing. We do no-till. We've been doing that for generations. We are environmentally friendly. We do sustainable farm practices. And then oftentimes the conversation stops there and nothing happens. And so the timing is perfect for this conversation related to the definition of sustainability, because there is an opportunity within systems like ours to help farmers and ranchers who produce raw commodities understand that it is more than what you are currently doing, because the data will tell you, and it won't take long when you get into conversations with consumers that, well, you put chemicals in the ground and you put hormones in animals, and I quit thinking about it, right? So there is a chasm there. There is a huge gap there that still exists with respect to the way our folks think about the definition of sustainability.
Mike, can you add to that? In your opening remarks, you talked about the issues that are bubbling up right now. Can you put some more flavor around that for us to talk
Okay,
about?
so none of this will surprise you if you're plugged into what, the attitudes that exist, that bubbled to the surface in 2020 in the United States, especially in the middle of the country in rural areas. There are a couple of different there are a couple of different issue areas that have surfaced that are causing consternation and woe within our system. One of them is this notion of national heritage areas, right? And the premise is some sector of the federal government designates some historical space. They put a picnic table, a trash can, and a sign, and call it good. Well, the challenge that has surfaced in 2020 is this notion of discerning what's factual, what's not factual. Social media doesn't make it any better, because those with an agenda or an axe to grind or with a political perspective will get on social media and communicate things that aren't true, and people who aren't deeply engaged in the conversation will believe that. And so in organizations like ours, that gets real difficult very fast. Another one at least has some basis in policy, and that's this notion of 30 by 30, right? And you're aware, in a broad general sense, the idea would be take 30% of the country's ground, 30% of the country's water, and make it, quote, sustainable. Well, again, imagine yourself as a family farmer or a rancher who is marginally engaged with his or her farm organization, and you have a limited scope with respect to where you get your news and information. It won't take long to spin these things off into significant controversies. And so those are the kind, that's the stuff we do in organizations like ours, right? And so the long-term answer, I believe deeply, is capacity enhancement of individuals and groups. Help give them the tools and the wherewithal to make better decisions. That's a long-term answer, but the short-term challenges get in the way of the work that needs to be done on behalf of the people that raise the commodities that become the food that we all consume. Does that get where you were going, Danette?
Yeah, Mike, that's great. Thank you. Ken, I was thinking about your opening comments, because you and your brothers made a conscious decision that we're going to get certified, we're going to do things differently. So you really have taken, to Mike's point, you're consciously making the decisions to figure out how to best move forward. Can you talk a little bit about the hard part of making those decisions? Like, what kind of conversations were you having? Because I'm sure there were things you were already doing that you weren't getting credit for, and then there were things you needed to change in order to get credit for. So share with us kind of the mindset in handling the financial and the community and the economic side of this social part of the issue.
Yeah. And, I think there's a key aspect of that you touched on. I don't know that we necessarily were doing things all that much differently than a lot of other farms are doing. We just made the decision to put a certification around it. And yes, we did have to do some things differently than what we were doing. We had to modify some SOPs. We had to change some protocols on farms, or some human resources practices, or what have you. But one of the key foundations of us becoming B Corp certified, or Kim touched on it earlier, the plethora of animal welfare audits that can be conducted on our farms. We are Validus certified, or Validus Dairy Care certified. We are farm certified. We're BQA certified. And we've done that for a few reasons. One, we feel that as our ability to become stewards of the industry, so to speak, we have a bigger responsibility than just making money. And that if we have a purely transactional view of our presence in the industry, in our local economy, or whatever, it ultimately creates a slash and burn mentality where I'm going to do whatever I can to make as much money as I possibly can, and your future success, that's your problem. That doesn't bode well for my future or for the future of our communities. So I have to create a different, at least in my own mind, and the goal being that I create a different viewpoint around long-term future success with stakeholders in my business that, and I go back to baseball, but if we just hit singles and doubles every time we're at bat, man, we're in the Hall of Fame. The long-term view of our business over 30 years is we all win, and we all win in spades. But if I go up and I swing for the fences every single time, well, home run hitters also have the most strikeouts. In agriculture and in business, you can't afford a strikeout. So we made the decision to take all those things that we were already doing and bundle them up into a certification that we think has power. Are we all that much different than the average farmer down the road? I would argue probably not. We've just made a decision to bring people into our farm, whether that be an auditing body, or we're very open to public presence on our farms as well. So we're trying to engage that consumer responsibility on our farms as well, or just the general public responsibility on our farms as well. We're just choosing to put a framework around what we're doing and to create a system ultimately of accountability. So I don't know that we're all that much different than the average farm down the road. Like I said, we've just chosen to bring in someone that helps hold us to a higher level of account.
Ken, I have to ask this follow-up question. My dad is not watching as far as I know, but he is a Southwest Kansas farmer, rancher, and we have cattle and we have row crops. And his question to you would be, how much more did it cost? And have you been able to make that up in profit?
Yeah, so that's always the question that gets bounced around between my brothers and I, because I'm more of the idealist, and some of my other brothers are a bit more pragmatic and financially based than I am. And it's all about the balance. But what I can say is that there was heartburn associated with us. The first audit that we chose to hold ourselves accountable to was the Validus Animal Welfare Audit. And there was heartburn around that because, much to what Mike has touched on, I've been doing this for 4 generations. You can't tell me what I'm doing is wrong. And frankly, yeah, they can, because what we were doing was wrong. We needed to get better. And this dogmatic approach of I'm right because I've been doing it forever, that mentality has got to change. And what I can say is that we now, and I'm without question, my brothers would back me up on this, being accountable to these sorts of certifications, whether it be Validus or whether it be non-GMO or whether it be B Corp, has made our businesses more profitable. But you have to look at them through a different lens, that level of profitability. It's our employee retention rates have gone higher. So turnover is costly. So reducing turnover saves my business money. happier cows are healthier cows, and I require less antibiotic interventions. Happier cows are healthier cows, and healthier cows are more productive cows. Healthier soils and saving my water creates longer term higher equity values in my farm properties. So changing our mentality around our businesses and our accountability within our businesses has also changed the way we measure financial profitability or financial success within our business as well. And yes, being more accountable has made our business better and more profitable.
So Ken, thank you. I've kept you on the hot seat for a little bit here with two more, but there's a follow-up question that's come in that I think the end of it is pertinent to the part of the conversation we're having now. And when Mr. Moore was talking earlier today, he remembered he'd shared this stat about the amount of land that was used for grazing couldn't be used for crops and other things. And the other speaker said, I don't believe you. What happens when you've done all of this good work and someone says, I don't believe you? How are you able to back up these statements? Is it the certifications? Is it other records? What's in place to get rid of the naysaying?
Well, number one is we keep having the conversation. We don't walk away and say, well, you're wrong, I'm right, and we give up. So first and foremost, don't give up. But second, what we do is we have tried to create structures within our business that can bring not only the empirical data that most people, their eyes kind of glaze over and they don't really want to look at soil, nutrient analysis or herd health records. That stuff typically doesn't connect with the average person. You've got to be kind of a dairy wonk to really care about herd health records, right? But what we also try to do is we try to, hit them right in the feels and have the anecdotal conversations around, the first cow we ever milked, and the set of triplet calves that were born yesterday, or the things that take people out to the pens and show them all the things that we do for environmental enrichment for our cows. If I just simply sit here and talk about what I'm doing and I can show you all the evidence, the conversation's lost, because 98% of the people aren't connected to agriculture anymore, right? So they're not going to be connected to understanding an acre of dirt. They're going to be connected to understanding what makes them feel good. So you have to have the evidence for the people that want the evidence, but you have to have the feel good for 98% of the other people.
Completely agree with that. And Kim, I'll pop it to you from there, because you mentioned in the I think it was you, it may have been Mike, you mentioned 2% in agriculture. That means 98% aren't. That means the 98% is dependent upon the 2%, and yet they don't think about that at all. So from your perspective, as you think about what is the convincing thing that helps a shopper make a decision, or a news person that's standing at the train station with you see something differently, what is that from your perspective?
It's such a fun conversation to think about, and fun and productive is my favorite combination. And that's really what you're getting at. And I feel like I do talk about that. And I did mention that because any audience I get in front of, I remind people that 2% and that 98% is a really critical factor in all of this. And I couldn't have said it better than what Ken said, where it's got to be about what does it feel like? That's the values part of the conversation. And the way that I kind of define it is, are we talking about product messaging and we're quote unquote spewing facts at people like this is right and this is right and this is right? Or are we going for audience understanding? Because how you frame a conversation needs to come from how that person's going to hear you. And the other way that you can look at it is there's the stuff that people ask us, and there's the stuff that we know that they need to know. And the interesting and important part of that is, how do we marry those two things together? And if you can steer a conversation where somebody starts, and this is a very silly example, but for sake of discussion, why is the sky blue? And after a couple of probing questions, you realize they really wanted to know why the grass is green. And I feel like we're so science-based and we're so excited when somebody asks us a question, we want to go right at it. But whether it's pesticides or antibiotic use or whatever in agriculture, that people blurt out a question. Before we get eager to answer that, we need to understand what they're really asking us, because they might be asking us something that they really don't even understand. They heard it on social media, or their friend said it in the backyard at a party or whatever. So it's a tricky kind of dance for that, but it goes back to, what is our end goal? Are we trying to build trust and understanding? Because that's what Ken's talking about, and that's what it is. It's like, we have to have the science to back us up, but we need to tell the stories that are real to people. And it's interesting to me because oftentimes you see the science holders, the keepers of the science, are like, the consumer doesn't want to know that. Well, but let's not hide it from them, because we're all consumers, scientists, doctors, nurses, like everyone ultimately becomes a consumer. And if we've got the science to back it up, I'll give you my dream. Recipes are a tool, because that's the action step to food, right? So you give somebody a recipe. What if they were online and that recipe, and you hovered over it, and a video popped up on every single ingredient about a family farmer and where that food hails from? Now, it's not distracting to the recipe, so if you don't hover, who cares? You can go about your business and make your dinner on a Friday night, fine. But why don't we do those kinds of things where we maximize where people are going and tuck those feel-good stories in? We do have, as Donald said, a country of family farms. So how are we helping to honor and elevate that and plug it in where people can find it, and tie it in and have people see that beautiful farm scene and a sunset, or, whatever the case may be? But why not have those feel-good moments? Why not bring them into the conversation? And I just spoke to a dietitian group on Friday, and I said, when we look at those tools, if you hand out a hard copy to somebody, maybe those words that are just on the page as ingredients, are we bolding them and saying the words in bold are the actual foods that are grown and raised in your region? And these are what you could tell a better story through the tools and the routes that we already have, and tuck those details in without them being distracting to others. Because I keep saying it's individual, and I just want to clarify, we cannot be everything to everyone. No matter what we do, we're never going to get people to do everything that we hope that they do, nor do we want that to happen to us. So how do we cast that widest net? How do we appeal to the most people? And we know they're interested in on-farm stuff. They're interested in how to cook stuff. They're boom, boom, boom. Where are our pathways? How are we giving them the tools that they need so people can choose to go down that path? It's kind of like those books where you could choose the different endings, and I'm dating myself, but it's like, you start here and they want the story to take them somewhere else. So tell that broad story in a way that doesn't tax our resources or our time, but we let people find their way to that truth. And I think if we can start to think of it more of a two-way conversation, that's awesome. And 2020 was a very serious time, and I'm acknowledging that, and we all know that, and we're still dealing with the seriousness of it, both from a business and a personal perspective. But here's a little bit of fun. If you go to Google, the #1 searched recipe was indeed sourdough bread. Who wasn't talking about that? The number 10 most searched Google recipe was banana bread. And people who have said for years up until 2020, oh man, I wish I could stay home from work. Now, what did they say in 2020? Oh man, I wish I could go to work. I hate being stuck at home. So if we can find the humor and the emotional human connections to some of this really serious stuff, the more informed they are, the more fun they can have, and the more calm and trust that we build through all of that process.
Great. Thank you, Kim. Mike, how do we take all of this and use it to inform and inspire constituents, but also have an impact in Washington?
Yeah, it's a great conversation. When I just heard Kim describe that, it makes me think one of the tactics we do is we put food bloggers, we find food bloggers and we put them on a bus and we take them for a day around Kansas to commodity farms, right? Connect the wheat with the croissant, connect the livestock with the filet mignon. And that works, right? That is a labor and time intensive process, and it works, and it reaches this many people, right? And over this much time, And so those are the kinds of things that weren't done 20 years ago. Those are the kinds of things that help change perception and help change attitudes. Because at the end of the day, with our success in our system will hinge on how successful we are at changing and influencing hearts and minds in Washington and in Topeka and in county commissions and in zoning planning boards across communities in Kansas and our counterparts in other states. One thing that made the conversation made me think of was early on when we first started this notion of outward facing messaging, right? Trying to reach people who aren't in the choir 20 years ago. One of the things that worked, and you saw this, it was ubiquitous across the industry, was the feel good message, right? Monsanto did this whole big deal that tugged at the heartstrings of family farmers and ranchers and the beautiful beauty shots and all of that. And it worked because what it did was connect the people who are only 1 or 2 generations removed back home, right? And my argument, the conversation that we are trying to lead within systems like ours is that there's a shelf life, right? That idea is perishable, and as time moves on, then we are further and further removed from that. And there's an argument to be made that in 2021, the people who are influencers that make the consumers, right, who buy these products and are concerned about chemicals in the ground and hormones in the animals, they often won't get past that thought, or they are savvy enough, right? Because this is the 21st century. They are savvy enough to see through the feel-good message and recognize it for exactly what it is. And so it requires, I think, serious conversations about effectiveness with respect to perception management. And those are hard to do in organizations such as ours. Those are really hard to do because of the culture that we mentioned. It tends to be, my perception is it tends to be 2 things: generational, right? And that's not a knock, that's a description, right? Younger people tend to get this because they have been surrounded by peers and colleagues who might think differently as opposed to their parents or grandparents. And it also tends to be issue driven, right? It tends to be time specific with respect to what's hot today. And so I think long term, the answer is, and I think Ken nailed this, we can't quit doing this. We will, in organizations like ours, this will become, there's an argument to be made that perception management becomes more important than policy development, right? Because if you can't, the people who will eventually decide on policy will be driven by what they think and feel about the product. And so that's hard for a hidebound, tradition-driven, 100-year-old organization that has been pretty successful at writing farm bills, right? To get to a point where you are, well, gosh, why are we going to spend so much on PR? We need to be spending more on lobbyists, right? So that is a ongoing, where I think we're smack in the middle of that, right? I think we're in that murky middle between what used to be and what is going to be.
Thank you. There's a question that came in that is perfect right here. This person, anonymous person, said, excellent session. Thanks so much to the panelists. Has anyone done research on communication/PR toolkits for farmers or ranchers or dairymen to determine how they address the topic of sustainability? How many exist and how do they communicate similar points? So does any of you have any background in that you'd like to share?
I'll say this. I think every agriculture advocacy organization, every commodity specific organization has done work like that. And so if you just start browsing websites, you'll find that. And honestly, that's part of the problem, right? Is that we all do these niche driven things and there's 18,000 different ideas and plans when we all need to be working together a little more often. So that stuff's out there. And again, the reason there's 18,000 instead of 18 is culture driven, right? That's the way I've always done things. We are independent farmers and ranchers. We get things done. We're going to do it ourselves. And the notion of collaboration is sometimes foreign or difficult.
Yeah, I'll build on that, Mike. I actually just got on my soapbox in a recent blog talking about the fact that one of the hardest things I feel that we have for in the real animal meat world is that we do have so many different messages we're trying to carry forward, whereas the alt protein world is very set on their direction. And they are all hammering that message. And the more they hammer it, the more they are creating doubt for consumers about our products. And if we don't address that in a way, in a loud enough way with the same message, we put ourselves in a position where we're not giving consumers the permission they really want to eat our products. So that is one of the hardest things. You're right, because everybody wants to go about it their way. And individually as producers, we can certainly do that. But collectively, there needs to be some kind of way to help coalesce this message to help really carry us through the times that we currently find ourselves in. Ken, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'm going to say yes and nod vigorously because I couldn't agree more. And when you look at how the public is messaged to, especially from a health and nutrition perspective, I'm sure you all know about My Plate. It's the visual representation of the dietary guidelines with all 5 food groups. I often like to talk to people about that image, not only showing you balance, variety, moderation, and choice on your plate, but it also represents every farmer and rancher. So literally every food that is grown and raised around the world could be said to be represented by that visual. So if you can get your audiences to see that icon, which is so simple to understand that there's an important role that all 5 food groups play for us, and everything you choose to eat, no matter what it is, you are supporting a farmer. And to me, that is a unifying message. And the other thing that I like to tell too is because, to Mike's point, there's so many wonderful resources out there that it almost becomes overwhelming. So I actually think USDA from that standpoint is a really good place to send people. And one of my favorite resources I've been talking about lately is the Founding Farmers blog that's actually on the USDA website that talks about the fact that our country was established by farmers. And to me, that really conveys the leadership that's happening from the agriculture space. And Abraham Lincoln, I'm in the land of Lincoln, so fun little fact, Abraham Lincoln established the USDA. So how do you find these moments of this unifying thing, but there's a place to start that people are like, I didn't know George Washington was a farmer. Disrupt the conversation with a factoid like that, and then you can see where the conversation goes. So I think the more we can help people find one landing spot, like choosemyplate.gov, which is now myplate.gov, you can find your way to recipes, to information about all those different foods. And that's just one thing, but that's one thing that people can remember and take away and find a lot of good stuff.
I forgot to unmute. Thank you, Kim. Ken, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I would just say that, when it comes to PR toolkits about communicating your message, Mike's spot on. Every checkoff group, every advocacy group has their own platform, own recommendations, own supporting materials, and don't get so caught up in the fact that, well, I'm a dairy farmer, so I'm only going to go to the Southwest Dairy Museum talking points or the Midwest Dairy. There's items to be gleaned from the corn checkoff, from the soybean checkoff. I mean, you can learn from all of them. And the key to that in my mind is that at the end of the day, it's your story. It's not the soybean checkoff story. It's the story of Danette Amstein Farm LLC, and you're in charge of that story. So don't be afraid to add your own spice to it, I guess. I mean, it is yours to tell.
Thank you, Ken. Kim, I'm going to change the direction a little bit based on an early comment you made about the culture part of agriculture. I think it's so incredibly important that we talk about that and how we carry that across to Ken's point of it's our story. The most impactful conversation you can have is the one-on-one conversation. But how do we bring that culture piece into this? You've clearly given it some thought. Give us some pointers.
Well, I was smiling. I believe it was Darcy that said it on day one. And it just was like, man, what a succinct way to bring that up for people. Because when you're having a food conversation, I want you to all picture your favorite meal. I don't care if it's one you make yourself from a restaurant, from another country where you were so excited to try the food. Picture your favorite meal and what makes that your favorite meal. because there's going to be an urban spice profile. There's going to be an ingredient component profile from probably at least 2 or more of the 5 food groups, right? And that story actually is an agriculture story. So that's why I think it's really fun to start, I'll say it again at the beginning, because when you travel to another country and you go back to why that food is connected to that country, couldn't you say it's an agriculture story? Because food is grown and raised where it makes sense to do so. And that's one of my favorite stories to tell too. And in fact, when you think about the word local, I would like that to be expanded. I just wrote a blog about this actually, because it's like local, you should know what's around you, and you have a responsibility and a feeling of pride to support the farmers and ranchers who are around you, your state, your region, and so forth. Understanding what is grown and raised well in that area, that's a cool thing. And it feels really good from a community perspective. And you walk into any grocery store or restaurant for that favorite meal, some of those ingredient components might not come from that, but it's still local to where that food was grown and raised. It is local to that farmer, and farmers are local around the world. So if we could shift the dynamic of that conversation, and not to make it distrustful, because we know what people say when local, they mean close to them. But couldn't we bring it through and say, what's your family known for? What is your favorite dish that your grandma or grandpa made, like passed down to generations? In my family, we eat grandma's recipe for sauerbraten at Christmas time, and that's my, so what's your story with that? And if you can answer that question for yourself, all of us, and then how does it feel if somebody tells you to stop eating it? How does somebody telling you, well, you need to change the ingredient component? No, we're not going to mess with grandma's recipe. We're going to say, well, maybe you don't need to eat 87 pieces of that. Maybe we could tone it down and balance it out with these other cool side dishes or what have you. But how do we have those conversation moments where we acknowledge that that food is helping define who that person is, even if they've never been to a farm where that is grown or raised? And that's the cultural part that I look at, because that's the piece where it's like, now I got you and you got me. Like, we can share a food conversation and we can travel in each other's worlds through that very comfortable space of food, if we let that food and flavor lead us into the next more challenging conversation. And if we have that fun conversation, they're going to be like, I talked to that person. I bet I could ask them. I've got this other question about it. It's more of a marathon than a sprint. You're building a relationship, and you're starting with the cool, fun, squishy stuff, I like to call it, and you're building a pathway so people can ask you a harder question. And I've had that happen privately through social media, direct messages all the time. Hey, you're the only dietitian I know, and this is what I need to know. And if I can't help them because they're not my patient or what have you, I can certainly help them navigate to get to the answers that they need. And that's the part that is so meaningful, and it's going to make us more meaningful to them across that whole supply chain too.
Kim, we often talk about, I like how you said that's the local part. It's the local part of the piece of the puzzle that's really the global story.
100%, well said, yes.
We can look at each local part. We have the global story that really can come together in a sustainable way.
Yep.
So Mike, from your constituent standpoint, how can producers best help you tell the story and carry that forward?
If you think about culture, right? If you try to unpack that word, culture is our experiences, what we have grown up with, right? What we have inherited from those who came before us, what we are used to, where we are comfortable, right? That's the way I define culture. And in Kansas, and I'm confident this is true in the whole middle of the country, right? That is changing so fast because of changing demographics. It's already changed on the coasts, but in the middle of the country, we are just beginning to see that change. And I like to describe, I'm in Manhattan, Kansas, right? We are home of Kansas State University, a land grant school, right? Abraham Lincoln and the Morrill Act and land grants were there's a whole legend associated with land grants, and they come together and they have extension and they help farmers do what they do, and it's led to the success of agriculture as we define it today. Here in Manhattan, many of you are familiar with it. We have a section of town called Aggieville, right? College bars. And it's where the college kids hang out. Pre-pandemic, it's where college kids go and meet other college kids and do what comes naturally. I will tell the story of today pre-pandemic. So let's go 2019. 2019 in Aggieville, you are just as likely to see a college kid with gauged ears and tattoos all over his or her arms as you are to see a young man with square-toed cowboy boots and a ball cap. And that was not true 10 years ago. And I don't, for those of you that are familiar with Kansas, there's another college town in our state, Lawrence, University of Kansas, liberal arts school, right? Lawrence has always been left of the rest of the state. And you can make a compelling case that Manhattan is becoming Lawrence. And that is really hard for people who have grown up in the culture that I described initially to get their heads and their hearts around. And so I think Kim nailed it, right? You have to, this is an ongoing conversation, right? You have to find different ways to communicate this. And it's not, there are success stories, you know, take a look at what's happened, take a look at how the conversation has started, right? On the coast that has led to understanding among disparate groups. We're not there yet, right? And so that's what we're looking at, right? And step one, right? Step one in solving a problem is being aware of it. And so we are now within our system trying to come to grips with the demographics that changed a generation ago. We're 21 years into this conversation now. And then what do we do about it? And so I guess I don't have a specific answer to the question, Danette, other than we are trying desperately to get people to understand that things aren't the way that you grew up.
So very true. And I'm not going to talk about what bars names existed when I was in school at K-State. But I will say a couple of years ago, we brought our team to Manhattan for our annual team meeting and took the creative team, which tends to have a few more tattoos than our ag kids, into Aggieville and shared a little of the history of it with them. That is one of the unique things one of the things I really love, and I guess I'm just going to get on my soapbox for just a moment here about our organization, because we are able to bring the ag kids together with those that know nothing about the meat industry and help tell the story. Because the ag kid can talk about it from our perspective. And then a new consumer is hearing it with fresh set of ears and say, did you mean, what is that? And it helps us really distill messages down, which has been successful. And it's something that's really important when you got to do it in 144 characters on Twitter.
Yeah, let's quick point on that. Well, one of the things we do here, right, is, and this is a relatively new component of work within our system, is we've established collegiate farm bureaus at colleges and community colleges across the state to do exactly what you just described, and that bring ag kids together with city kids, for want of a better term, right, and allow them to have that conversation. And it happens naturally because that's what happens when you go to college, right? You meet other people. And it's easy there because you have structures and you can allow that to occur. The challenge is, how do you do that for the Ness County Farm Bureau, right? How do you do that for the Stanton County Farm Bureau, who rarely have the opportunity to interact with people with gauged ears and tattoos?
Good point. Very good point. Ken, you've opened up the farm, the dairy, to the public to come in. When folks drive in the driveway, what kind of conversations, what are they interested in knowing?
You know, obviously COVID has changed all of that. Our farms were on lockdown for, the entirety of 2020 and just kind of beginning to open back up now. But what I would say is that every group is a little bit different. We've hosted multiple, two of the food blogger tours from Farm Bureau. We've hosted animal rights activist groups. We host the Red Hat ladies. We host the kindergarten class, the FFA, the collegiate level judging teams, you name it, and they've pretty well toured our farms. And what I will say that is the common theme amongst all of those groups is they want to have a connection with the person, and they want to know that you care. And, At the end of the day, it's not so much about the empirical scientific data that I can provide them. It's about the give a crap factor, basically. You know, they want to know that the food they eat starts at a farm that cares about the cows that produce it, that cares about the land that feeds it, that cares about the community that it lives in, and ultimately cares about the person that's going to eat it 15 value chain steps away from the farm that produces it. You know, hey, yeah, do we get the questions around antibiotic use or polled genetics or GMOs or hormones? Yeah, we get all of those. From every different group has a different twist on it. But at the end of the day, what they really want to know is that you give a crap about what happens on your farm and ultimately what happens to them.
Super, thank you. We had another question that came in. Actually, I'm going to save that one for just a minute. Mike, I'm going to come back to you. I know that you recently wrote a column about GM, and I think that that column is very pertinent to this conversation. Do you want to share that kind of the thoughts there and the take on sustainability through that?
Sure. In addition to my day job, right, at Farm Bureau, I have 2 or 3 side hustles, like we all do in the gig economy. And one of them is, and before I was a press secretary, I was a journalist, right? I covered politics and government for a statewide radio network and a television station based in Topeka. So I've got a background in journalism. And so I'm friends with the publisher of the Manhattan Mercury, and he has allowed me for the last 4 years to write a column for the local daily here. And I try to stay away from issues in that column that impact my day job, because I want to keep the job, right? I'm addicted to the paycheck. But I use that as an opportunity to sort of to raise big picture issues that can be thought of under whatever umbrella. And I wrote one here, I don't know, a month or 2 ago about after GM made their decision. General Motors made the decision, you'll recall, that by 2035, they are going to transfer completely to, they're going to get away from the internal combustion engine, right? And the point that I made was that the execs at GM didn't just wake up one morning and decide to do that, right? That was based, no doubt, on years, if not decades, of conversation about what the trends are, what the demographics are, what the car buying public wants and expects, right? And so that is a concept of looking at their consumer today, doing enough data research to get a sense that, my gosh, General Motors, right, is going to change its entire business model based on the way consumers are thinking. And I traced it to my father. When I was a kid, we had 1960s era Pontiac station wagons, right? These great big aircraft carrier sized station wagons. And he believed this notion of as goes GM, so goes the nation, right? That was an idiom that was popular then. And the concept was General Motors is so big and it is so pervasive in the American economy that whatever decisions they make must be right, right? And that worked back then. And so if you carry that idiom forward to today with respect to the thinking and the thought and the data research and all the market analysis that had to go into that General Motors decision, you can make the case that as goes GM, so goes the nation. Well, I kind of hope so, because that tells me that General Motors is reacting to what they see as the emotional decisions that the car buying public will make 14 years from now, right? And I've been around long enough. My experience tells me that in industries like that, General Motors may be the first, but they won't be the last, right? If you look at food companies, right? Look at the decisions that food companies have made lately to PepsiCo and Quaker Oats getting away from racial stereotypes, right? We're Aunt Jemima is a thing of the past. Uncle Ben's rice is a thing of the past, or soon will be, right? And so you can make the same case that those decisions were made based on what those company executives saw as the decision-making power of their consumers today and in the future. And so that was the genesis of the column. I could probably go on, but I think that's the gist of kind of kick us off.
I think that there's an interaction there with what we're talking about in agriculture. We have to be looking forward. We have to be thinking about what's coming next, because ultimately we need a market for our products. Otherwise, there won't be another generation. And for those of us that have the multiple generations, we want that next generation to be able to do what we did. So there is that connection. So how goes GM? So goes the nation. It also goes with what's going on in agriculture. Mike, you were talking about how we used to have a connection. At least you knew your grandparents were on the farm. You talked to someone and their grandparents were on the farm, and we don't have that. And because of that, these stories have to go into more detail and go to, Ken, your point of connecting to the fields. We've got to give them the fields that both Ken and Kim were talking about. So Kim, from your perspective, if you think, I'm going to take you back to the sausage story, because I know everyone's wanting to hear the sausage story. But that I think that's along the same lines. GM is looking forward and trying to figure out where to go. And now we look at why sausage was created. If we look backwards, and we look at some of the mountains processed foods have had to climb to continue to have a place on the plate. Share the story with us and your thoughts on how sustainability comes together in all of this.
Well, this is my favorite kind of origin story. And so the way that I sort of oversimplify it for a variety of reasons is, back in the day, humans had to travel to their food. We followed our food around, no matter where, if you will. And then agriculture was invented, allowing us to stay put and have a year-round, affordable, abundant food supply. And then you think about food preservation, which is where the story is salt. And you think about all of these wonderful phrases that are so positive about salt, worth their weight in salt. I could go on and on about all of those very important moments that salt played because of the food safety and preservation and the role that had back in the day and what that meant before we had refrigeration. And then refrigeration comes into play, and plumbing and transportation becomes easier. We figure out how to move food to us. So now you could say we had to travel to where food was. All of these wonderful things happened, including agriculture. And now food travels to us. We don't have to travel to our food. It comes to us. Now, obviously, I'm oversimplifying, and there's places in the world that that's not the case. But for sake of general discussion, it's really shifted. And once you have these other options come in, think about a salt and sodium conversation we're having with the world now. And the dietary guidelines just came out, and people are eating excessive sodium. People aren't making their own bread and cheese, so they might not, or sausage for that matter. So you start to forget from generation to generation, just like you do on the farm, the functionality of the different ingredients and what that meant to us as a people and what that meant to our survival. And now all of a sudden, it's like, why do they put so much salt in everything? And it's like, let's back up the bus and remember where we started with it. And can we be comfortable with a portion control conversation for a variety of reasons? Because if you do have something where there's a lot of sodium, sausage, bread, cheese, where there's a food safety component and there's a cool history story to why it was made and invented the way that it was, you can shift that conversation. So it's no longer, oh my gosh, why did they do that? To, oh, that's so cool. And yeah, you know what, maybe I don't need to eat the entire loaf of bread in one sitting. And maybe I can have a couple things from these other food groups, because that's going to be super delicious anyway. And you can start to change that dynamic, just like with that simple story that I had at the train station that day, because it's just forgotten. And I think we get so frustrated because there's such misinformation out there, and the dynamic has changed. Our needs have changed. Science continues to march on from the farm to the table. That's why the dietary guidelines shift every 5 years and we get a new version. It's to reflect current science. The nutrition facts panel that I alluded to, the changes are not about product formulation. It's to reflect current science and that's relationship to our health. So by helping people understand the infrastructure, we almost have to look at ourselves as detectives and problem solvers. And if you think about the fact that everything that any of us are doing in this conversation today is to provide a solution for someone to use to meet their goals, whether it's taste, celebration, health management, a variety, because that's the other part that makes this so tricky is what does sustainability mean? What does health and wellness mean? Well, it's sure going to mean something different on a holiday or a birthday. All of a sudden, the priorities within that one person that we thought we had figured out, they're looking at it differently because of their context. So I think if we can look at ourselves as solutions providers and we can say, you know what, we know people are making different choices for a variety of different reasons, depending on the day. And that's really why I'll throw the term out there. Here's another word for you, well-being. It used to be health and wellness. It used to be people talked about health and wellness and it was managing blood pressure and cholesterol and blood sugars. And it had much more of a clinical connotation, if you will. I think that is evolving and that health and wellness conversation just keeps getting bigger, but attention spans don't, and our time with our audiences doesn't. So we need to all of a sudden become really good at tight messaging and answering those questions and encompassing everything that makes that person feel the way they do about food while we're solving their problems. So does it make them happy? Are they, I mean, look at food. We grieve with it. We celebrate with it. We're bored. We eat it. Like we eat it with our favorite game day. Like we have all these food culture moments. How do we say, you know what, that's one day. Your party food's at the party. Awesome. But if you're the only one at the party, maybe that's when we can have a conversation about other food choices to make. So it's a constant nudging and dynamic. But if we always come from that problem-solving place, I think that's going to serve us very well, no matter what our expertise is.
Great, thank you. Mike, Ken, anything you'd like to add to that before we change topics? All right, Ken, next one's for you. I commend you on your progressive work from your company for your company and employees. How are you focusing and taking into account diversity and inclusion, gender, ethnic backgrounds, race, etc.?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think it's one that, you know, is top of mind, at least in a lot of the talking heads on all the news cycles today, you know. But hey, diversity is something that, frankly, simply just given where we live in the industry in which we have chosen to stake our profession in, we aren't very diverse. And it's something that, you know, historically, I don't think has been a real talked about topic within agriculture, diversity and inclusion and those sort of things. And the simple reality is, in my mind, that as rural communities become more and more depleted from a population and from a well, you know, what's the term, the brain drain from rural America. You know, it's the brain drain is happening, but it's also just purely the plug has been pulled and people are just leaving. So rural America, I believe, and agriculture in general is going to have to become much more inclusive when we think about who can work on our farms, who can be key stakeholders within our businesses, and become much more inclusive. But as it pertains to our business in particular, you know, we had never done a diversity study within our farms. But as we chose to become B Corp certified, those are things that are talked about, and those are things that, frankly, I don't know if we can change them, just given the nature of where we live and where we farm. But we didn't score all that well in terms of diversity. But it's something that we as a company and given our commitment to improving our B Corp scores, we're committed to making a better effort at improving those diversity scores.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go a different direction here with this one. Donald Moore's comment on the percentage of the Earth's landmass that is a pasture and why and how the grasses are grazed and converted to protein is a fact that the majority of consumers and the general public don't understand. Which groups should be and would be best at getting educational information into schools and on social media that won't look like farmers and ranchers are just using the facts from a marketing opportunity? Any thoughts on that? Mike, you want to start us off?
Yeah, great question, right? And the genesis of the question, I'll read into it, is is clearly the conversation that's underway with respect to policy issues that are top of mind. So let me pivot briefly to go into a larger sort of awareness education conversation related to who do you want to reach and how do you want to reach them. Right? We in this system, our mission is advocacy, education, and service. Advocacy is lobbying. Service is helping your fellow man and loving your neighbor. Education can be whatever you want it to be. Education can be awareness. Education can be communication. It can be perception management. That is, and it goes back to my earlier comment of that will become, given the demographics, that will become issue priority number one for systems such as ours. But when I think about that question specifically is, who do you want to reach and what do you want to tell them? And that's where it gets a little messy with systems like ours, because it bumps right up into private property rights and landowners' rights. And it gets difficult to determine who you need to reach. We had a quick story that relates to this. Like many states, in Kansas, there is a system that exists called the Foundation for Agriculture in the Classroom. In many states, that system is connected or is housed and is structured within the Farm Bureau organizations. It is not in Kansas. It's separate and standalone. And so we started, when they had an HR change here a year or two ago, we started a conversation with their governing board about, you guys are doing what we want to do. Can we have a collaborative conversation about structural changes that will lead us to an outcome where we are accomplishing your mission, which is reaching children in the classroom with what you want to reach them. And by collaborating with us or others, we can potentially bring more resources to the table and reach more people. And we worked for 2 years on that and got nowhere. And so it goes to the cultural conversation that we had earlier with respect to how difficult it is to get people within their own sort of frames of reference to think differently or to recognize the demographics that are on the ground today in Kansas, in the middle of the country, that have been on the coasts for at least a generation, and what that means in terms of how you translate to actual classroom education or awareness efforts trying to reach people about CRP or whatever. It all too often, the structural cultural questions get in the way of the actual communication of the message, right? And so we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do you knock down these sort of barriers so that you can actually do the work. And so that's a roundabout way to get to that question, but so that's where we would approach something like that, right? If you want to reach people and you want to communicate to them about CRP or about grasslands or whatever, let's get the right people in the room. Let's remove the structural barriers, and then let's figure out what we want to say to them. My experience has been in 20 years of doing this work is that oftentimes the work doesn't get done because you can't get past those structural barriers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's disheartening, but I appreciate the truth because it is something we have to recognize. There are others not in that position. There are others that are finding ways to collaborate and carry messages forward. Now, I'll go back to the alt protein. I shared the charts at the beginning. We did some research internally a couple of months ago on just where their advertising dollars are spent. And it was very shocking for me personally to see the amount of advertising dollars they spent just in Q4 of last year to convince our consumers that their meat is real. Tremendous amount of money, more spent in one quarter than the beef checkoff has to spend in a year in advertising spaces. So if we can't figure out how to get our resources collectively together and all going in the same direction, we are helping them do what we don't want them to do. And that is a frustrating space to be in.
Let me just to build on that point, right? I think there is a shelf life for this conversation. It built up slowly on the coasts because of demographic changes, right? It is happening overnight in the middle of the country, in the long pull, right? These conversations have just started. The pandemic didn't help because we all kind of took a year off, right? And so now we're trying to get re-engaged on these. And with the changes in Washington, the policies associated with these conversations have gotten very real, very fast. And so I think there is a shelf life for action and for actual change. And Danette, I think you are spot on. If we don't make that change within that shelf life, we as an industry run the risk of being isolated and pushed over here in a corner and, oh, it's you guys again, right? And so those are the sorts of things that keep me up at night related to this big picture conversation.
Great, thank you, Mike. Kim?
Yeah, it's funny because you think about the urbanization of our population in so many areas, and that the notion of people never setting foot on grass, never actually seeing the soil. There are lots of people that describes their reality. So when I think of the magnitude of the question that you're asking to the audiences that probably need to hear it the most, and maybe they're participating in social media conversations and they're one of those people who never get the chance to even see it, touch it, smell it, well, however you want to talk about it, the magnitude of that from an emotional perspective and why they would care, and the notion of even thinking that this soil somewhere else that they don't see is doing all these magical things for us. We have to start at the beginning of the story with that too. And so I think there's such an infrastructure conversation, to Mike's point, and build on what he's saying. We almost need to say, how do we embed agriculture education at every level of the school in the context of something that's meaningful to them? So is it that we need to look, and I'm going to start like way pie in the sky. If this was a brainstorming, what do we wish? Could we look at all the textbooks, and are the math problems embedding agriculture information? And when we think about the stories that they're reading in English class, like, are we helping engage the content in the infrastructure of the process? And so that's my big dream. How we handle that is one bite at a time, like Ken was saying earlier about something else. But I feel like it's an inherent thing that change needs to happen I feel like we're scratching the surface. That is my big dream that I've just revealed to you now, is I wish we could do it from that standpoint. And I know, just thinking about some of the earlier conversation, in the health professional world, you can actually go in the toolkit space of that conversation we were having. There are actually entities to help, like if there's a show about doctors, to make sure that they're doing an authentic story. Or oftentimes you see in a movie or a television show that they worked with such and such group to make sure the details were right. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could do that for agriculture and food? And maybe you guys do this too, and maybe I'm just a strange dietitian, but my favorite shows, if there's a meal scene, I'm looking at what's in the glasses and I'm like, is it milk? Like what are they drinking at a family dinner that they're showing on a sitcom? What is the food being served? And what are they eating in the newsroom or the police station of your favorite show? And that sounds so detailed and granular. But if we don't look at it, in my opinion, from that infrastructure forward, like what constitutes cool, what constitutes normal behavior, how are we messaging to people about food, even when it's not the main storyline, those moments all matter. And it all leads us to where we are now, trying to unwind and dig out of the conversation to get to a place where we can be heard about the science and the other things.
Well said. Well said. Ken, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I don't have the answers on how to move the industry forward together to create that connection. But what I do know is that it's a reality that we're going to have to deal with. Rural America becomes further and further sparsely populated. The United States and the world population in general is becoming more urbanized and less connected to agriculture. We need to become better storytellers. And what I can say that I know will not help our efforts to create a better and deeper connection with the consumer is allowing bad actors to maintain operation in the ag industry in general. Polluters have got to go. People who don't take care of livestock have got to go. People who are not good stewards of their communities and of the industry have got to go. I was told when I was in college at K-State, spending far too much time in Aggieville as well, that that before I got in college, it was the era of the good operator, the efficient operator. That was what was going to determine survivability. And while I was in college, it was the era of the good marketer, the person who could sell their crops or their commodity for the higher price. And eventually, I think we've reached a stage where this race to, I call it the race to the bottom, to become the most efficient, the leanest, the most productive for the lowest cost. At some point, you've squeezed all the juice out of that fruit that you possibly can. And my view is that moving forward, it's going to be the era of the value add, the good operator, and that in a very interconnected society that has the ability to understand or see what's happening on your farm, good or bad, in a second, there's no place for bad operators in the future of agriculture.
Well said. I don't think we need to say anything more, because I know we all are in agreement with you. It doesn't help move us forward one bit. We've only got a couple more questions. So if you have a burning question you want to ask, please get it in. Otherwise, we might wrap up sooner. I'm still working on that punchline, though, for how this will come together. So someone can help me out there. Let's see. The next question is actually an early question. I think it comes from the comments I shared earlier. Samantha asked, do you think ASF, the swine flu, had an impact on the negativity towards pork in the numbers? I do, Samantha. However, I'm going to put an asterisk beside that because of the timeframes we were looking at when the conversation was taking place. That's really more of a global conversation than a domestic conversation. So while it does cause some fear and it does create some consternation, it's not, I don't think we can put a big chunk of it to ASF right now on that one. And then the next one, Ken, for you, was your decision to become non-GMO certified and purely an economic decision?
Yeah, and we get asked that often. And to be perfectly honest with you, we took a fair amount of heat when we made the decision to move to non-GMO. And I think a lot of that is grounded. Well, to answer your question directly, no, it wasn't purely economic. It was a request that was made of us by our customer, and it was more from and I don't want to speak for my customer, but from their viewpoint, it was more about optionality to the consumer, providing the freedom of choice to the consumer that it might only be 2% of the consuming population or the decision-making population, or the shopping population like Kim talked about, that cares about non-GMO, but we and our customer want to provide that option to them. But what I can say about that is that, when we made the decision to move our farms to non-GMO, there was a tremendous amount of confusion about what that even meant. We had a variety of different farmers come to us, gentlemen or ladies or gentlemen that supplied our farms with feed, that simply said, well, you mean I have to go organic? No. That's not what we're talking about here. All we're talking about is traded seeds versus untraded seeds. That's it. And so there was a great amount of confusion around what moving to non-GMO actually meant. We were blessed with a great network of farmer partners that were willing to travel down this path with us. And since then, the feedback that we've gotten from those farmer partners has been their highest yielding and highest profitability crops have been those non-GMO hybrids. Now, that being said, I don't want to come across as being anti-GMO. I believe that the best thing for the ag system is a diverse ag system. Ag systems that have organic, that have non-GMO, that have GMOs. I believe that is the best thing to create a resilient and robust ag infrastructure that has the responsibility to feed 7.2 billion people today. So my fear is that when, as an industry, we go whole hog into one sort of technology, man, I think if 2020's taught us anything, that diversity is a good thing.
Great. Thank you, Ken. We got a couple more questions that have come in. This first one is, do urban consumers care if our rural communities have good vitality? I'm going to open that up to the group, but I will start with some research that our organization did every month to 6 weeks during COVID to really get a feel for what people were talking about. And if there is a silver lining to COVID for those of us in agriculture, it's people were like, wait a minute, where's this food coming from? They really started to pay attention to that. Local became more important, regional became more important, and the people caring for their food became more important. In fact, we saw in one of the national studies, it's the Power of Meat study, for the first time ever, when we asked a question, I'm not going to get it exactly worded right, but when we asked a question about what's important when you're thinking about your food purchases, for the first time ever, among the list of price, color, taste, animal welfare, on that list was the well-being of the people raising our food. And so COVID brought that about. Now we need to make sure that that stays in consumers' minds and helps move it forward. So I'll open up to the rest of the panel for anybody else would like to add to that.
Well, go ahead, Mike.
No, go ahead, Ken, please.
I was just going to say, I think the pandemic gave us all a chance to talk about things that we've known for years are important. And all of a sudden people are asking the right questions. So we get to tell them what we know. So I think that's really exciting. So I agree, Danette. I feel like we need to keep that conversation flowing. And at the same point, there are people who never thought about it. And so I think this is a moment where we need to have different stories available for our different audiences and have them available where they're most likely to find them, because the people who care about that care immensely. And the people who've never thought about it need a gentle way to enter into the conversation because they don't know what they don't know until they know that they don't know it. And that's what 2020 was for so many different important topics. So I'll leave it at that, Mike, and turn it over to you.
No, times two. That's my speech. Exactly.
Okay, here's another one that came in from Jared. Do you anticipate that sustainability will impact the ag finance space? Ken, you're nodding. We'll let you go.
Yeah, I think it will, and I think it already has. I think about Northwest Kansas in particular. When it's already hitting us, whether or not we call it sustainability or not. When we go in and when we evaluate a piece of property to buy, we're already looking at the water on that ground. We're already looking at the soil types and the soil conditions on that ground. We're already looking at how that ground was cared for. So even from just the basic operational capacity, it's impacting ag finance. But beyond that, when I put my ag lender hat on, and I'm having more and more of these conversations, water preservation, for example, and I talk about that because it's near and dear to my heart, and I live it every single day. If I'm being a good steward of the water under my feet, that gives a greater longevity to the equity or the value of that ground that I'm buying. And as such, in my mind, that just makes logical sense that ag lenders would begin to care about that. And I think, as for the examples I mentioned earlier, they already do care about it. They may not be framing it in with the language of sustainability, but it's already there and they're already talking about it. And that being said, we're already talking to groups that are green investors that, hey, they're willing to provide you with funds, maybe at a better interest rate or with lower bureaucratic, paperwork to deal with in a traditional lender for quote unquote green investments, conversion of ground to regenerative ag practices, conversion of ground to organic, maybe it's infrastructure projects like a biodigester or things like that. Those groups are already there, and it's it's real and it's happening. So I absolutely believe that it's going to become just a bigger and bigger part of the conversations that we have around sustainability.
I agree with everything Ken said, and just a couple of other thoughts related to that. Bankers are like any business individual, right? They will be driven by market forces. And what we are currently dealing with now, as a result of the last 4 years, is there's a lot of federal government money that has flowed to family farms and ranches. And so they get a little hinky about that because it's not market driven, it's not private sector driven. And there's another interesting dynamic that I've seen with bankers in small towns. A 63, 64-year-old banker will think differently than a 28 or 29-year-old banker with respect to this question. And that's a result of the way they came up, right? And so they will be looking at different factors to make the decision on the operating loan, whereas the 64-year-old guy is probably more willing to give the benefit of the doubt and give a loan on a handshake, right, based on a relationship. The 28 or the 29-year-old banker is going to need more data. And that is only going to get better or worse depending upon your perspective.
I'll add to that just one note, especially on that investment side. It's been really interesting as we've watched new money come into agriculture. And that's a great thing for new money to come into agriculture. Now, where the money first came in from my perspective in the meat industry, sounding like a broken record because I keep talking about plant-based and now cell-based meat. They came in there first, and it was how can we change the world through those efforts? But now we're seeing it really come into to smaller brands and to folks in the clean label space. Can just like you mentioned, the whole idea of what green looks like, wide definition for it, wide use of funds. But there are folks paying more attention to agriculture in that space, and I think it will continue to have an impact on the ag finance sector for sure.
I would add one thing to that as well, Danette, that I think is an emerging concept, maybe not emerging, but maybe not very well adopted concept within ag finance being linked to sustainability. And that's the value of things, of environmental benefit credits. You know, as Mike touched on, operating loans and that sort of thing. As ag producers, our ability to go out and tap into alternative revenue streams through, you know, the marketing of our best practices and the credits that we can create based off of that. One, I think it can help us penetrate marketing deals that maybe we hadn't thought about prior to that. But at the very brass tacks level of it, it can serve as an additional revenue stream to our businesses to help make our businesses more sustainable. And the net win to that is that, hey, our soils are healthier and our water resources are better sustained. We're less erosion at risk. And hey, if you make a little bit more money at the end of it, great too. You know, I mean, it's a win-win-win.
Agreed. And in fact, the Ag Committee just sent it to the Senate for carbon credits that could be create a nice win-win-win for a lot of folks. So something worth us watching and paying attention to. We have another question that came in. I'm going to rephrase it just a little bit, given the fact that we've been talking about the urban consumers and the coast and how the world looks very, very different. We just finished some research. Actually, it hasn't been released yet. We saw it earlier this week for the first time on multicultural research and some of the fascinating differences between how whites eat, blacks eat, Hispanics eat, and Asians eat, and how we need to be talking to those audiences and really helping bring food. Kim, you talked about the local aspect together for all of those groups. You know, for those of us that work in an organization that is primarily one race versus another, our recipes can become a certain way because we all eat steaks and potatoes, right? And that doesn't work for this country anymore. We have to be more culturally sensitive across all areas. So I'll just throw this out there based on the question: how do we help producers be more sensitive to the culture, the multicultures that exist inside of communities, and how do we better communicate to consumers from your perspectives?
So since you mentioned me and I'm off mute, I will go first on that one because I feel like this is an onion with multiple layers. And as we start to peel back, we do have those major buckets of humans, if you will. But then when you look at the Caucasian or white story, German, Irish, French, like there's so many other nuances within every single one of the races and every single one of those important conversations that we need to have. And then where we live and where we were born and how we were raised and what the culture around us in addition to our own family culture. So it becomes a very deep, very important, very nuanced conversation very quickly. So I think we need to be sensitive to that, but we also need to make sure that we're not oversimplifying a very complex piece of the cultural piece of this puzzle, because it looks very different even within the groups that you mentioned. So it's a tricky dance, it's an important dance, and it's one that has a lot of right answers. And I think the first is just knowing that we need to be sensitive and aware that it's not a prescriptive one size fits all, no matter what we're talking about.
Great, thank you. Mike?
Yeah, I think Kim's spot on. In a system like ours, right, where 99.999% of our members look like we do, right, then it becomes a really difficult conversation. And there are two very distinct conversations that surround this issue in organizations like ours. And one is, I love everybody. I love my neighbor. That's why God put me on the planet. End of story, right? And the other one is, well, we're a lobbying organization. Why do we care, right? We exist to advocate on behalf of family farmers and ranchers in Washington, and we are going to do that work. And so what has happened as a result of the cultural conversation that has started on the coast and has moved to the middle of the country is lights are going on and eyes are being opened to how important it is that this issue gets incorporated into that actual work conversation, because the people you are trying to influence think that way, right? And so take your natural sort of cultural feelings that you have, that you love everyone, and think deeper about those and take it to the next iteration of thought and action and apply that to the work that you need to get done. And that will allow individuals and systems and teams to be cognizant of it. But it is really hard to have that conversation in the middle of the country where everybody looks like we do. So my belief is, and it's not just me, there are others within our system and in like-minded systems in the middle of the country that recognize that's our job, right? That is our job as an advocacy organization, to help our members understand the importance of this conversation and then to assist them in having it.
Great, thank you. I'm going to wrap up here unless any of the panelists have something they're like, oh, you know, I wanted to say that. Now will be the time to work that into the conversation before I put a wrap on this. Anybody got anything?
I want to say one thing. We, before the pandemic, I was very fortunate to lead a statewide strategic planning conversation for our organization. And you can imagine what that would look like, right? 105 counties in Kansas, 105 county farm bureau boards, right? Various stakeholders, the board of directors. We've got members all over the place. We've got voting members, we've got associate members, very broad and diverse organization. And there were 5 strategic recommendations that came out of that. And I'm not going to detail all 5 of them because many of them are inside baseball to our organization. But one of them is very specific to this conversation. And especially as you think about the ability to affect change. If eventually our goal is to influence hearts and minds and consumer decisions, then people, family farmers and ranchers, right, will understand emotionally and mentally the need to do that. What they lack is, and I don't mean this the way it's going to sound, what they need, what they want is the ability to be effective. And so one of the recommendations that came out of our strategic plan is this notion of we as a system have the opportunity, the resources and the ability to enhance the capacity of people who want to do good work. And so what you will see systems like ours doing, and you see this all over the middle of the country, and I think it's a great thing, is you will see more what we will call leadership development, professional development, capacity enhancement, sort of efforts and programs aimed at helping family farmers and ranchers who grow the raw commodities understand, get a better sense of how to think about this stuff, how to act about it. That's the role of systems like ours, that if you're eventually going to be able to create a conversation about sustainability among stakeholders that I'm privileged to work with every day, then we can give them the ability to give them the skills to have that conversation. So I get excited about that. I don't know if this is like a debate and we do closing comments, but that's my story. So thank you all.
That's perfectly fine, Mike. Thank you for that. And there is a question that came in and a comment, and then I'm gonna try my best to put a punchline on this. So Jared's question you asked was, I was recently part of a learning session that covered the growing market for verified natural beef. We had an executive chef speak to the group about beef quality and his experiences with beef throughout his career. He stated that sustainability was just as much his responsibility as everyone else along the value chain to the consumer. To use the entire carcass was a part of that process. Is that a common thought in his space across the food service industry? Kim, you got any thoughts on that?
Did you say Ken or Kim?
Sorry. Kim.
You know, we could talk for hours about so many of these different aspects. And I think people compartmentalize a lot of details about agriculture and don't have that bigger picture. And we have so many incredible stories to tell about what happens beyond that food, because most people interact, they roll up to the meat case, they pick what they're going to have for dinner or lunch, and it's not even a thought, and they're not thinking about all of the other amazing things that are happening. So I think that's one of our challenges, is we need to figure out a way to say, when you're looking at this one component, this one food, this one choice, you're actually making a choice for so many other incredible things. And I have to say, during some of the sporting events, seeing some of the different agriculture groups talking about the different aspects of agriculture that come into play for your favorite sporting event, down to the uniform or to the equipment that's used. And I share that as an example because it's bringing context into a very challenging conversation where people they're not even thinking about that because they've got no awareness of it. So I'll say that we need to start at the beginning of the story one more time, because if that's a takeaway that I can give you, that's where we need to be. But every single person's start of the story is just a little bit different.
Very true, very true. And in fact, I was working on some closing comments, but I don't know who S. Keller is, but thank you for summarizing it so well. I'm going to steal S. Keller's comments here. Ag industry leaders and those that work daily in agriculture need to know the facts and kindly and yet assertively and confidently share what they know with friends, relatives, and neighbors. The story starts with us. We carry a lot of influence in our small spheres, and our spheres impact others. Because I know if you're in agriculture, people are asking you the questions that they don't know who else to ask. And that gives us the opportunity to share those conversations. Kim, Ken, Mike, thank you so much for your time and for joining and hanging out with me today here to have this conversation. It has been fantastic. And before I turn it back over, here's my best attempt at putting a punchline on this. So if we had a dairyman, a dietitian, a marketing executive, and a press secretary walk into a barn, what would be the conversation? The dairyman would say, I put milk on the table in a sustainable way, but I have the evidence, but focus on the feels. The dietitian would say, I make sure that what's on the table is healthy and talk about sustainability in a fun and productive way. The marketing executive might say, I share your story so we can get that table to begin to trending on Twitter. And the press secretary, well, he comes running in late and he looks a little ragged. And he says, hey guys, I'm sorry I'm late. I had to get through all the defensive red tape just to even get here. That's my best attempt at it, Lucas. We'll turn it back to you.
That was great. Thanks, Danette. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Gabe and Kim. You guys did a fantastic job putting all this together. And, you know, we really understand how how complex this is, right? But I think you shed some light on how we can better try to engage with our consumer or shopper, as Kim wants to call them. So I think this is really helpful, and I think we should do more of these conversations in these type of forums through NIAA. So thank you again. And what we're going to do now is take a quick 15-minute break, and then we're going to come back for our final speaker, Charlie Arnot, who he's a very dynamic presenter and will give us some consumer insights. And we'll try to put all these and wrap up all these 3 days that we had, these fantastic conversations. So see you in about 15 minutes. Thank you. As we'll tie up the conversation together, our next speaker brings his experience as a journalist, a corporate communications director, and leadership as a CEO for the Center for Food Integrity. To conclude the 2021 NIAA Annual Conference, Charlie shared with us not only the theory of enhanced sustainability, but the lived experiences and practical guidance of several food systems leading organizations. So Charlie, I'll transfer the podium to you. So
hi, welcome. My name is Charlie Arnot. I am the CEO of the Center for Food Integrity. And it's my pleasure to spend a little time with you today talking about the evolving opportunities and challenges of sustainability. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Center for Food Integrity, we are a not-for-profit organization with affiliates in the United States and Canada, focused on helping today's food system earn consumer trust. We believe the trust is every organization's most valuable and tangible asset, and it should be managed, cared for, and invested in just like the other assets. We're very fortunate. We have a very diverse and committed board of directors that includes organizations like Costco and Cargill, Cisco and Chick-fil-A and Starbucks and the National Pork Board and Dairy Farmers of America, the United Soybean Board, the World Wildlife Fund, and many others. If you're interested in learning more about the organization, I encourage you to go to foodintegrity.org to learn about our mission, our programs, and our leadership as well. So today I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the evolution of sustainability and the transition from just sustainability to ESG, environment, social, and governance, the evolving platform, where sustainability kind of started out as just being green, right, being environmentally responsible. Today, CFI has identified more than 250 distinct individual attributes of sustainability, or ESG, that someone on the food system is working on. You can see a list of a number of those on the screen in front of you, whether it's health and wellness, animal welfare, racial justice, ID&E, or a range of other issues that impact people, animals, and the planet. So it's a much more complex matrix than it's ever been before, and it requires us to think more diligently about the challenges and better understand what the actual drivers are of the evolution we're seeing from sustainability to ESG. Driver number one, more consumers are voting with their money. We've heard for years that people are more interested in purchasing products that are socially responsible, but now we're actually seeing that happen, particularly with millennials and Gen Z. Consuming more plant-based products, those in animal agriculture certainly recognize the 40+% increase year over year from 2019 to 2020 in plant-based protein alternatives to meat. That trend continues to grow as consumers are looking for options that are better for me and better for the planet. Our opportunity is to help them understand they can achieve both of those through animal protein products just as easily as they can, if not better than, from plant-based alternatives. The demand for greater transparency and label confusion. As consumers are wanting more information about where their food comes from, who raised it, what's in it, etc., they're demanding greater transparency, and there's confusion about what different labels may mean, which leads to greater skepticism and, again, more information-seeking behavior, which is also an opportunity for those of us in agriculture to provide that information, to be that conduit, to develop those trusted relationships. As I mentioned before, greater interest in the environment, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and the impact on climate change becoming a primary focus for those companies who buy directly from animal protein producers, as well as for consumers who ultimately consume the product. Greater interest in the relationship between diet and health, particularly coming out of the pandemic, as people are looking to boost their immune health and understand the greater understanding rather of the relationship between diet and health, and of course the concern about animal welfare, which has always been there, but we've seen a resurgence of that in early 2021, whether driven by advocacy groups or others. It's a combination of things, but we're really beginning to see an uptick in the food system interest in animal welfare again, much as we saw probably 5 or 6 years ago. So as we begin to think about how this is impacting all of us in agriculture, we can look at it through the lens of the supply chain, starting with customers, those who are directly engaging with consumers, who oftentimes serve as a proxy for consumers. Walmart perhaps being a primary one is the largest retailer, where they are setting targets with Project Gigaton to take a gigaton of greenhouse gases out of the supply chain by 2030, focused on 6 areas, one of those being sustainable agriculture, as well as energy use, waste, forest, packaging, and product use. Global companies like McDonald's looking to their supply chain, where they say, by joining forces with our partners, their beef sustainability goal is to influence industry-wide changes on a global scale. So again, another global player saying we recognize our obligation. We're the direct connection with consumers. We're going to take consumer interest and reflect that back into the supply chain and ask for changes in our supply chain to meet these environmental goals. The Biden administration has also chosen to focus on a number of other topics and issues that will clearly have an impact on agriculture. Secretary Vilsack and the focus on having farmers be directly engaged in climate change and fighting climate change through a variety of practices and programs and policies. Greater concern about water quality. What might that mean to different organizations involved in agriculture? The recognition by media and others that the U.S. is now back into the fight against climate change with the new administration, and also the linking of different priorities in that broader ESG context. You can see here in the New York Times, climate change and inequality meeting on Black-owned farms. So we're beginning to see the complexity and the interconnectedness of all of these issues come to bear in a way that's new for those of us in agriculture and requires a different thought process and how we're going to address these more effectively. Perhaps one of the biggest influences that we've seen is really from capital providers, and BlackRock being the largest private equity fund in the world, making climate change a primary priority for them. And Larry Fink, their CEO, saying climate risk is investment risk, and it will be evaluated as such. So some of the 2020 highlights that they noted in their annual report: 100% of all of their actively advised BlackRock strategies are now ESG integrated, covering $2.7 trillion in US assets. The next one was a stunner for me. I had to go back and double check the numbers. Aladdin Climate, their climate risk tool, went from having 12 to 1,200 KPIs in their sustainability metrics. They voted against management at 55 different companies who they felt were making inadequate progress. And since they released this report, 61 of the world's largest companies all signed on to common standards to allow investors to compare their progress on an apple-to-apple basis. Companies like Bank of America, Fidelity, Heineken, Nestle, McKinsey, PayPal, Sony, Unilever, and many others, all now committing to similar standards, so investors can begin to evaluate which of those companies they think is the best investment opportunity for them based on things like their impact on climate change. And as Fink has said also in one of his letters, companies and countries that champion transparency and demonstrate their responsiveness to stakeholders will attract investment more effectively, including higher quality and more patient capital. So now not only is this something that we're talking about as it relates to consumer pressure, but also lenders are weighing into this game to say, we have a role here to play in mitigating climate change, and we're going to use our lever as a capital provider to drive that change in agriculture. And it's happening all the way from the boardroom to the dining room, as McKinsey notes in this report. Executives and investment professionals today largely recognize that ESG issues can affect company performance, and the financial impact of ESG programs is likely to increase as expectations and scrutiny from investors, consumers, employees, and other stakeholders continue to grow. So when we think about all of those different stakeholders who have an interest, we begin to get an appreciation of this cycle of continuous influence, as we've called it. So animal agriculture, your company, your organization, your species, put yourself in the middle of that. and begin to look at this from a 360-degree view, understanding all of the disparate stakeholders who have an interest in what you're doing as it relates to priorities for ESG that might be relevant to them. So it could be NGOs, it could be environmental groups, clearly the customers who buy products, capital providers, as we just mentioned, consumer influencers who are increasingly influencing other segments of this supply chain, policymakers, and then media, which are increasingly fractured and segmented. And so it's important to know which media with whom you need to engage and how best to engage them to be able to help them understand the commitment to things like environmental sustainability and other ESG priorities. We've done some research at the Center for Food Integrity to identify what are consumer priorities when it comes to things like sustainability and transparency. And of the 5 that we've listed there on the screen, there are 3 of them that kind of rise to the top. The impact of food on health, that makes sense, right? It's about me and my family. What's the immediate impact that I can understand? Impact on the environment, climate change, which has become a rallying cry for the entire food system. And then impact on animal well-being or animal welfare, because we have that ethical obligation to make sure the animals we use to produce food and fiber are in fact well cared for while they are in our care. We've also seen an interesting shift as it relates to sustainability and health and wellness since the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, the concern was really about what's in the environment that might harm the planet. So if I'm thinking about inputs or crop protection chemicals or greenhouse gases or methane emissions or whatever it might be, what's in the environment that might harm the planet? Because of the increased interest in personal health and impact on family, that's now transitioned to more of a concern about what's in the environment that might harm me or my family. So this shifts a little bit from being kind of the external to the internal. So now it might be, what are the animal health products that might be contained in the products that I'm purchasing as a consumer? What are the other products or residues might be finding their way into my food, into my kitchen, into my family? So we begin to see this reshaping a bit, where it's not just what's in the environment that might harm the planet, but now it's what's in the environment that might harm me and my family. Earlier this month, the National Intelligence Council came out with a brand new report, Global Trends Looking 20 Years into the Future, 2040. The title of that report is A More Contested World. And I want to share with you just a brief excerpt from that to indicate the growing complexity and volatility on all issues ESG around the world. You can see the quote there, many populations are increasingly pessimistic and distrustful as they struggle to deal with disruptive economic, technological, and demographic trends. Newly prominent identities, resurgent established allegiances, and siloed information environment are exposing fault lines within communities and states and undermining civic nationalism and increasing volatility. I bolded the last part here. Populations are more informed and have greater ability to express their demands. Now, note that the report said more informed, not necessarily better informed. So they have more information and they are using their ability to communicate digitally to have greater impact and express their demands. That's part of what we are seeing unfold in this evolving ESG environment. We're also seeing a major shift now where businesses are really being called upon to be the arbiters of social trust. Because today, according to Edelman, business is now more trusted than government, and we know they can act more quickly to drive social change. Public policy is always a lagging indicator of societal attitudes. Our democratic processes were established to be deliberate and slow to assure that they didn't move too quickly and enact change that was not going to be in our collective best interest. But because technology and other systems move so quickly today, public policy is always going to be a lagging indicator. So businesses are now stepping into that space and really playing the role as arbiter of social trust. One quick example, on Sunday, April 11th, remember this happened on a Sunday, more than 90 CEOs and senior executives of a range of companies you can see there, ranging from Fox to the big airlines, gathered to discuss how to address a growing trend of state legislation that is restricting voting rights. Started in Georgia, it's going to other states. And so these CEOs came together, excuse me, to be able to address what should we do? What is our role in that situation? After that summit, they issued the following statements. CEOs who participated in a live poll indicated they would reevaluate donations to candidates that supported bills that restrict voting rights, and many would reconsider investments in states which act upon such proposals. Now, you may recall this is on the heels of North Carolina losing $3.8 billion in 2016 after the legislature there passed what was known as the bathroom bill, an anti-LGBTQ bill. NCAA, NBA, other big performers all pulled out of North Carolina, costing the state $3.8 billion in business, and the state repealed that bill less than a year later. So we're beginning to see that play out again as we look at states that are considering voting rights restrictions in state legislatures. Now, park those issues, right? Take those issues aside. This isn't about either of those specific issues or topics. I want you to just think about the example of what we're seeing here, where business executives are now saying, okay, it's up to us as we face increasing pressure from employees, customers, and other stakeholders to get more engaged and to be more involved in establishing what should happen in society and to maintain social trust. So we're seeing an important shift. So forget about the specific issues and think about how this can apply to food. As we think more about climate change, as we think about animal welfare, as we think about other issues, begin to get an appreciation for how this pressure is going to be driving CEOs to take more action on all ESG issues. And this is a role CEOs are now embracing in a way they hadn't before. So what do we do? What action can we take? How do we prepare to mitigate the risk and capture the opportunities? Well, at CFI, we've been working on a program for the last several years, and we're very pleased to be working with a number of companies today to help them optimize sustainability or to find the right balance among ESG priorities for their organization. Because it's very difficult. As everyone in agriculture knows, you can't change one variable in an interrelated system without accounting for the impact on other variables. And so it really is important to understand what is truly the sustainable choice. How do we balance all of these potential competing issues? Too frequently, what we see happen is pressure applied in one place and action being taken without taking into account the impact on other variables within the interrelated system. So what we have proposed and put together is the Optimizing Sustainability Framework, which can help companies better evaluate those changes and the potential impact so they can make the choices that are truly sustainable and balance their ESG priorities. We want to thank those who've made this possible. You can see the leadership group as well as the United Soybean Board that helps provide support for food system dialogues and consumer influencer engagement. Debt of gratitude to all of those organizations, not just for funding, but for helping to shape the content of what we've put together. Optimizing sustainability has three basic modules. First is about setting sustainability priorities. The second is about evaluating trade-offs. And the third is about responding to requests for commitments. Frequently, when we hear from a company or an organization, they're at step 3 and they didn't do steps 1 and 2. So they're responding to a request for a commitment from a particular organization that's putting pressure on them to take a position on one topic or another, but they haven't gone to through the exercise of establishing their priorities or evaluating trade-offs. When you start with number 3, you find yourself playing whack-a-mole issues management because you're always having to deal with the new topic of the day as opposed to being able to say, these are our priorities, these are our values, here's how we're going to rate these, here's what we understand about the trade-offs. Now we're in a better position to communicate them effectively. So let me take just a few moments to walk through these and then we'll open it up for questions. Module 1 about establishing sustainability priorities, 8 steps that helps the company, again, create that framework, and it's for companies that either don't have a program or those who are looking for more specific guidance. And I'll give you a couple of examples of companies with whom we are working in just a minute. But the important point here is this incorporates business objectives, company values, and stakeholder interest. So it allows you to integrate all of those in establishing the sustainability priorities for your organization. You can see the 8 steps here. Establish your team, identify your business objectives, clarify your values, who are your stakeholders, what are the relevant attributes, get some data and information, identify stakeholder concerns and evaluate those, finalize the trade-offs, and then you finalize your priorities and rationale. It's a relatively simple process, a lot of steps within to gather information and data, but it's pretty straightforward. And in going through this, organizations come out of it with a clear understanding of their priorities and their objectives. Module 2 is about evaluating sustainability trade-offs. This is where people sometimes fail to take into account the interrelated nature of a food system. If we decide to limit an animal health product availability within agriculture, or we change a housing system, or we change something else within the system, and we don't account for the impact on other variables, we find ourselves shortcutting the process and ultimately perhaps having a negative impact that's inconsistent with our overall ESG objectives. So this is a 4-step process to evaluate trade-offs. It begins by identifying what things are non-negotiable based on your values and priorities. For most organizations, those will be things like food safety and worker safety. Gather life cycle assessment and sustainability data on the other attributes in your evaluation system. Summarize that data to visualize impacts being evaluated. And a debt of gratitude here to Marty Matlock at the University of Arkansas, who really helped us put together a very simplified dashboard with data behind it, but a very simple visual dashboard that will help decision makers evaluate trade-offs very quickly. And then finally evaluate trade-offs and decide what your next course of action may be. So just wrapping this section up here, this is kind of the dashboard that I mentioned just on egg production. So the policy or practice in the left-hand column, if you were to go to cage-free eggs, what you would see is a negative impact on the environment as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions or egg air quality, negative impact on egg production, food affordability, and cost of production, food safety and worker safety, depending on the data. Those are non-negotiable. That's why they're listed in red. You can see negative impact on that, negative impact on hen mortality. However, there is a positive impact in laying hens to express natural behaviors. So it gives people the opportunity to say, is allowing hens to exhibit their natural behavior a greater priority in looking at the trade-offs than these other impacts and making that evaluation. Now, there is peer-reviewed and published data to support these conclusions, and that information has to be available so that these conclusions have a foundation. But the goal is to provide a dashboard to allow decision makers to evaluate these options relatively quickly. And then finally, module 3, responding to requests for commitments. What do you do when someone says, hey, we'd like you to take a position? This is simply a very simple series of decision trees to evaluate and respond to requests for pressure campaigns. One, you have to really understand the issue, take a comprehensive look at it. It may be something you already well understand or something that's relatively new. Evaluate the source. Are they credible? Are they collaborative? Is this a group with whom you could work? Or are they simply trying to apply pressure and leverage you for some other purpose? Does it align with your current strategy? If yes, great, you can begin then to move forward. If not, then you may decide that you're going to have to take a different course of action. Then you plan your engagement and your response strategy. So all of these tools are available if you want to download them and take a closer look at optimizingsustainability.org. We are working with a number of companies in this process and are happy to have more conversation with you as well if we could be helpful in allowing your organization to work your way through these, in finding a way that helps you balance these priorities and the increasing challenges related to ESG. So in closing, let's walk through the takeaways. First, ESG priorities are increasing in number, volatility, and complexity. You have to know what's important to you. That gives you the ability to establish your own priorities and to communicate more effectively with others. We can't just be the party of no. We have to be those who say, we understand the concern, we appreciate the concern, here's how we see that, and here's what it means to us in the supply chain. The pressure is greater than ever before, and it's simply going to increase. So we have to be prepared to engage and continue to increase our preparedness because the pressure is going to increase as well. We want to assess the trade-offs to assure any decision is sustainable and aligns with company or organization values and business objectives. If you go through this first, you're in a much better position then to communicate those trade-offs to your stakeholders and others to whom you may supply. Communicate your decisions transparently and be prepared to support your position. Again, not just being the party of no, but being the party of yes if or yes and as you continue to go through that conversation with others who are looking for changes. Understand also it's less about a single issue and more about balance and optimization. And again, by going through and establishing your priorities, it allows you to communicate that more effectively because you're more comfortable in understanding how do we balance and optimize our commitment to sustainability and ESG. So the opportunity is to find those places where you are aligned and where you can talk about the progress that you're making. And the opportunity to mitigate your risk is to better understand and have those priorities established so you can communicate more effectively. So those are the opportunities. We hope you're able to take advantage of them as we go forward. We are working with or have worked with companies like Starbucks and White Castle and Progressive Beef to apply this model in different ways to help them to clarify their priorities, evaluate trade-offs, or communicate more effectively with stakeholders. Happy to do the same with you if that makes sense. Thank you again for your time and attention today. It has been a great pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to taking your questions and having more conversation as we continue to move forward. Thanks again.
Thank you, Charlie. Very interesting presentation, and I'm interesting that you brought in the conversation, and you started with what Larry Fink from BlackRock sort of stated. I think that's the first time I heard of ESG, and I think it's the amount of assets that they manage and the pressure that they can put on other companies is greater. So I think it brought ESG to the forefront. But I had here a little excerpt from what Larry Fink put on I think the 2020 letter to shareholders, and he talks about companies with better ESG profiles are performing better than their peers, enjoying what he calls a sustainability premium, which I think is interesting. And when we heard in our past panel, Ken McCarty talking about sustainability and putting in place practices that actually they're going to make money for the farm. You cannot implement ESG or sustainability and not be profitable. And it's the same with Larry Fink. He's in the business of making money. So I think those two things, ESG and profitability, have to go together, right?
Absolutely, they do. It's a great point, Lucas. And I think one of the opportunities is for early adopters to recognize what's coming and then to find the opportunity before it becomes a requirement, and then it's just a cost of doing business. So, for example, let's assume that there's a certain practice to minimize carbon emissions or something else in terms of animal welfare. Those who are early adopters and move there more quickly may find a market opportunity, whereas if it becomes mandated either through regulation, legislation, or through the market, then it's commoditized. And once it's commoditized, then it's just another cost. And so there are lots of examples. Fair Oaks Farm obviously is an example. There are many other feedlots and others who have found ways to identify that these are the coming trends, the coming requirements, and we can actually create the opportunity by being there early and being an early adopter and creating a premium for products that will ultimately become commoditized as these requirements become mandated for everyone. And just in the last week, we've seen a number of banks and other financial institutions come out with other metrics and programs to measure and evaluate corporate sustainability and impact on the environment. That's just simply going to be our reality going forward. And so again, from my perspective, it's about finding the opportunity there, capturing that sooner rather than later, because if you wait, it's simply going to add to your cost of operating.
Interesting. So here is a question from an anonymous attendee talking a little bit about that, looking at from a different angle. And he says, have you worked with any companies that have gone too far down the road without full information? For example, are there any examples of companies that have set sustainability goals they cannot meet and had to walk back or reset?
Yeah, great question. So just earlier this week, the Retail Council of Canada evolved their position on laying hen housing and gestation stalls. The Retail Council of Canada had actually established a policy on both laying hen housing and gestation stalls. They have now evolved that position to say, as a council, we will no longer have a position on those issues. We will allow our individual members, retailers and others, to have their own corporate position. In the meantime, we are going to engage in a multi-stakeholder process to further evaluate those issues. So I think we're at an interesting point here, and animal welfare and housing is a great conversation to have at this moment, because we are at an inflection point to meet. We'll just take cage-free housing as one illustration. To meet the current demand between now and 2025, it would take about $7 billion in investment to either convert or create enough cage-free housing to meet the commitments of all of those companies that have made commitments. For that to happen, that has to begin in 2022. By the time you find the land, you get your permit, you build the barns, you get them stocked, you're actually beginning then to produce enough eggs to meet the commitment. Those producers have to begin actually making the transition next year. So there are conversations taking place today across the food system about how do we evolve our position. And I think it's important to understand that it is an evolution. It's not backtracking, it's not falling back. It is really an evolution of thinking, better understanding how do we optimize sustainability, and how do we do that in a way where we can articulate that as a company, as an organization, we balance a number of competing variables. Our impact on the environment, our ability to provide safe, high quality food that's affordable for many consumers, the health and well-being of our workforce, animal welfare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As we consider all of those different impacts, here's the decision that we've made. That's a very defensible position, Lucas. And what we know is if you explain how you made a decision and why you made that specific decision, you reduce the likelihood that people are going to be outraged by it or upset by it. I think it's also important to be very clear about the stakeholders for whom you're making a decision. Who's actually going to drive that decision? As we've seen, at times we end up responding to the loudest voice in the room or a particular group that's applying pressure, as opposed to taking a more holistic view. So I think what's happening now is the hens are coming home to roost, pun intended, around housing issues, where people are beginning to realize we're going to have to make some difficult choices. And we either need to evolve our decision where we're considering other options, or we're going to have to make some significant investments. The challenge being that lenders are really not in a position to lend additional capital for conversions unless there's a long-term contract. And retailers and others are unwilling to make a long-term contract. And so we're really in this very challenging moment where between now and a year from now, something will have to change. Either we'll have to make a commitment and make the investment, or we'll have to evolve our positions on some of those challenging issues. So I think we're really at an interesting point in time where we can introduce these concepts and have broader conversations across the food system about how do we evolve our thinking and evolve our positions to truly optimize sustainability, as opposed to simply respond to the loudest voice in the room.
Very well said. So I have another question here. With animal welfare, which is a little bit what you were talking about, there has been a trend of public shaming companies into a commitment on sourcing. Have we seen these in ESG?
We have, and we will continue to. And I think one of the elements, one of the modules of the Optimizing Sustainability platform is how do you respond to requests for commitment? And I think companies are beginning to better understand that, there may be a social media campaign, there may be a website established, there may be something in the communication environment that attacks them for a specific position, but they're becoming a bit more savvy in terms of how do we evaluate the potential impact of that. So we're not simply responding to every campaign that comes across the transom, because there's always going to be a next issue. There will always be a next issue. And so really what we're trying to do, and I think what companies can think about is, how do we create a framework for considering all of these issues as opposed to simply responding to the next topic? Because whoever defines the issue controls the debate. So if we allow the issue to be defined as this or that, so cage-free versus cage, gestation stall versus no stall, antibiotics versus antibiotics-free, versus a more holistic view of the production system and what's in the best interest of people, animals, and the planet, then we're constantly responding to that debate. If we reframe this in a broader context, it allows us to have a more informed conversation with our customers, food companies, and ultimately with those consumers who are interested about what this means, and to help companies understand that there may be an aggressive attack on your brand for a period of time. There may be a website that comes out, but is it actually going to have an impact on your business? And to evaluate that, so they simply aren't just going to respond, because the challenge is once you go down that path, it's never ending, because there will always be another issue. There will always be another topic to which you will need to respond, because there will always be more pressure.
So another question from an anonymous attendee says, it is
Anonymous is very curious today.
I know, yeah. We need to put their names on anonymous. It is harder to communicate priorities when they are nuisance. like the
Nuanced. Yep.
the dashboard appears to be. Like I guess he's referred to your dashboard that you showed there.
Yeah,
So.
it's a really good question, and I think this is where we're always trying to. JJ wants to respond to that, so we'll give JJ a chance to answer that. But I think this is where it's important to understand the level of information that decision makers are seeking. So frequently, decision makers are not necessarily going to be technical experts. And so they're looking for a high-level summary, but they also need to know that there is credible data to support that summary. So it was actually counsel from Marty Matlock, who's much more experienced in this sector than I, and his work across the food system to say, we tend to drown people with data, and that doesn't really help them inform their decision-making process. So how can we summarize and synthesize the data where it's just an up or down arrow, positive or negative? And then if someone wants to look more into that, they go, I'm not sure I agree that that's positive. I don't think that's negative, right? Show me the data. At that point, you're given permission to have a more detailed conversation, to talk about the nuance and to provide the information. So again, this is one of those places where it's not either or. The dashboard is very, very simplistic. And if you are a person who has technical background and technical knowledge, you look at that and you go, well, this is ridiculous. There's so much more that we need to take into account. You're absolutely right. What we're trying to do is to distill it to a point where if I'm a decision maker and I'm looking at 100 different issues a day, I have an at-a-glance look and I can begin to make a decision. David Fikes, who serves on the Center for Food Integrity Board and is also head of the FMI Foundation, the Association for Retail Grocers, he sums this up really, really well and helps provide a perspective that's been helpful to me. When he said, your average grocery store has 40,000 plus SKUs on the shelves. Every one of those comes with a potential issue, right? You can't expect the retailer to be an expert on those 40,000 potential issues. And so this is designed to help synthesize and simplify some of that information, but to make sure that the foundation is very credible, peer reviewed, there's good research. So if someone wants to dig into it, they can understand the information is credible and fact-based, but it's synthesized and distilled to the point that it can be easily used by a decision maker who's facing a lot of complex decisions on any given day.
Interesting. So I guess I have another question. So
yes.
when you think about sustainability and the consumer or the shopper demanding more sustainability from animal agriculture, that a lot of times comes with the price premium, right? And people need to be willing to pay a little bit more for sustainable food. So how do you talking about more of worldwide view, how do you think that this application of sustainability and ESG metrics will help us to continue to be able to feed the world with affordable foods, especially in developed world?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that are taking place today. I think there is, in our conversations with some of the global food companies, there's a growing recognition of the fragility of the primary producer, and a concern that primary producers, farmers, and this is not limited to animal agriculture, but that primary producers are at risk, and that without primary producers, there is no supply chain. And so there's a growing recognition of the fragility of primary producers. And I think one of the conversations we need to have, and we need to begin to facilitate across the food system, is how do we equitably distribute the costs of ESG across the supply chain? I think that's got to be part of the conversation that we have. And it can't be, again, too frequently, agriculture has been the party of no. And that's not in our best interest. We have to be willing to come to the table and have the conversation collectively to say, we share the concern about sustainability. We understand we need to be able to mitigate our impact on the environment. We're willing to take that action, but we also need to be able to be economically viable if we're going to continue to be sustainable. So we need to have a conversation about how are we going to equitably distribute the ESG costs as they come into the system. The other thing that will happen, Lucas, is that innovators will find ways to have yes and solutions. They will be the companies who can find ways to be more sustainable and maintain a more competitive price. And so those will be the early winners in all of these debates. Those who find those solutions and can implement them more quickly will find increased market share. Those who can't will not. And so I think collectively, we need to have that conversation around how do we more equitably distribute ESG costs across the entire supply chain. Individually, companies, producers, and others need to look for those yes and solutions, where you're looking for a greater positive impact on my environmental performance. Wonderful. I can do that, and I'm going to be able to maintain productivity at a level that will allow me to be price competitive. So if you've got the collective issue and then the individual issue is how I would look at approaching that particular challenge.
Fantastic. Thank you for those insights. So I don't have any more questions from our panel. Do you want to have any concluding remarks, or?
No, I just really want I just want to thank you and NIAA and JJ and Morgan and others who've been involved, the planning committee, those who've attended today and those who will be watching this going forward, for your interest and commitment to animal agriculture. It is the bedrock of our rural communities and obviously our protein system. So thank you for the work that you do. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you. If there's anything else we can do to be supportive or helpful, we're happy to have that conversation.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And so as we conclude our day and really our conference, let me welcome Kevin Mayer back to the virtual podium, and Kevin will lead us with some concluding remarks. Kevin?
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect. Yeah.
Very good.
See you too. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Lucas, for conducting a great session this morning. Thanks to all the great speakers and the partnering organizations who made the annual conference such a tremendous success. The past 3 days have been incredible, and we really do appreciate everyone in attendance, and especially we want to thank JJ and his team who did a great job of managing this virtual conference. I know it wasn't easy. We all struggled with it a bit, but they pulled it off well and kept us in line. So we appreciate that very much. And we look forward to gathering in person. We appreciate you joining us in this virtual setting. Together as we advance the animal agriculture sector of our food system. Looking forward into your future, into the future of virtual gatherings of NIAA. I hope to see you at our 11th annual NIAA symposium, or an antibiotic symposium that will take place November 2nd through 4th in Kansas City. You'll see more details coming soon, and we look forward to that as another great event for NIAA for the 11th year. And please go ahead and mark your calendars for 2022, our annual conference. We will gather at the Marriott in downtown Kansas City. So that will be April 20th through the 22nd of next year. So we'll finally be back together and look forward to that event as well. Thank you all the NIAA members, and our annual meeting will begin. Our membership meeting will begin at 12:30 p.m. Central. So please use the annual meeting link that you should have received in your inbox to join the meeting. And we wish everyone a great break for lunch, and we'll talk to you at 12:30.